Alright, hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock episode 365 part 2. Of course, there's plenty more questions to be getting on with, so let's just kick off with whatever we have as our first question for now. Dr. D.M. Platt asks, you've mentioned a formula for determining the odds in battle based on the square of the differences in numbers or capability. Could you go into more detail and provide examples of when it works or fails? Yeah, so these are known as Lanchester's laws or the Lanchester equations. And they're actually still used in current military strategy. That's how effective they are. Now, there are some limitations. You do have to modify for quality because at its baseline, the equation is purely about number of guns. And it also assumes that the units you're feeding into the equation can actually directly engage each other. So if you were going to do a Lanchester equation calculation for, say, the encounter between Scheer and the Grand Fleet at the Battle of Jutland, you can't just plug in values for every single torpedo boat, cruiser and battleship and battle cruiser on both sides, because a good chunk of those just aren't engaged. If you wanted to work out what's going to happen before you do qualitative adjustment, you need to work out which ships in Jellicoe's formation are firing on Scheer's formation and which ships in Scheer's formation can return fire. And those would be the ones that you would enter into the equation. And it also assumes what I would call discrete firepower. So in terms of naval ships, this ship is firing at that ship. So the naval equivalent of a flamethrower, an indiscriminate weapon that can target multiple ships at once, doesn't work within the Lanchester equation. So for example, you couldn't use the Lanchester equations to work out the outcome of a nuclear exchange between two fleets. But the fundamental point of the equation is that at its baseline, your effectiveness depends on the square of your firepower. And it assumes, of course, that you can actually hurt the other side as well. So if we were to take, for example, an engagement between Bismarck and the Renown class battlecruisers. Now, without adjusting for quality and so forth, in terms of gunnery accuracy and etc., if you're purely looking at a main battery gun engagement and you put Bismarck up against a Renown, so 8 15-inch guns versus 6, well, obviously there's a certain inherent advantage already obvious there because you have 2 extra guns. But when you run both of those through the square function, you discover obviously 6 squared is 36, 8 squared is 64. That's actually a 77% advantage in Bismarck's favour, as opposed to the 33% advantage that you'd suggest just looking at 6 and 8, because obviously 6 multiplied by 1.33 recurring is 8. But with the square, Bismarck's advantage over a Renown goes up quite a bit. But if you put in the other Renown class, so you now have 2 Renown class against Bismarck, then you have 12 guns versus 8. So at the starting point, there is 64, 8 squared, but versus 12 squared, 144, that's a 225% advantage, as opposed to a 77% advantage in the previous scenario. So that would suggest that Bismarck has a comfortable margin of superiority over a single Renown, but 2 Renowns engaging Bismarck, firepower-wise, have a massive advantage. Now, of course, as you run the equation, if there's 2 units, each with 6 guns, and Bismarck's engaging and it manages to knock off one of them, then suddenly the equation flips back around again. But that's at a very small and very crude scale. This is before, as I said, you adjust for things like quality, protection, and so forth, all of which are kind of add-ons to the basic Lanchester equations. And on a macro scale, where you've talked about like mass fleet engagements, air campaigns, major land battles, I think broadly speaking, the Lanchester equations have usually given results pretty close to what happened historically, unless somebody forgot to factor in something really important like a major defensive advantage or qualitative advantage or something like that. Jim Latos asks, I read in Neptune's Inferno that the crippled Yudachi was seen flying a white flag before she was sunk by USS Portland. I've always been a bit skeptical of the idea that an Imperial Japanese warship would attempt to surrender, but what do you think is the truth behind this story? And side note, would you ever consider doing a video on Jim Hornfisher? I think it would be a good tribute to the man who got many of us started down the rabbit hole of naval history. So on the side note question, yeah, I would consider doing that, although since I only ever interacted with Mr. Hornfisher, well, once live and once in correspondence, I think what I'd prefer to do for that video would I think I'd reach out to other historians who knew him a lot better than I did, and kind of basically do a compilation of, you know, little fun anecdotes and stories and so forth from those historians relating how they knew and interacted with Jim Hornfisher, with me just basically providing the framework of, you know, what he did, what books he published, etc., etc. Now, as far as Yudachi is concerned, I can believe that a white flag was flying, because when a ship is in the middle of being taken apart by another opponent and basically all hope is lost, command and control breaks down to a certain extent, because either the commanders are dead or they're cut off from portions of the ship. And so even if they're alive, they can't communicate, either because the communication systems are out or there's a massive wall of flame or something that's cutting them off from another portion of the vessel. And at that point, when it becomes kind of every man for himself, you will get pockets of people who decide, actually, you know what, we've done all we can. There's no point in prolonging this further. And therefore, you might well have some portion of Yudachi's crew who decided, actually, I'd prefer not to die in a horrible inferno of fire and shells. I'll raise a white flag and hope for the best. There's, you know, some reports in a similar vein that perhaps some elements of Bismarck's crew and the stern section of the ship did a similar thing towards the end of her stay on the surface. But of course, these are reports, and this is one of the small problems with surrendering in a World War II naval combat engagement, because by the time you get to a point where you probably would think about surrendering, you have probably been deprived of almost any way of communicating your intent to surrender, apart from hoisting a white flag from somewhere, at which point your ship is shambles, there's smoke and fire everywhere, and your enemy's still probably several miles away. Then the chances of them spotting that in the middle of all of what's going on and then deciding to acknowledge it is actually relatively slim, because of course, if, let's say, someone in the stern section of the ship has decided to surrender, they might not fire on you. But if you close in to accept the surrender, someone on the bow who hasn't seen what's going on there might decide to fire on you. So do you take that risk or not? Because you kind of see that with the actual survivors of Japanese ships that have been sunk as well. Some of them will absolutely refuse to be helped out of the water. They prefer to die in the water than be taken prisoner. Others will not cooperate, but they won't stop you from fishing them out. And others will quite happily swim up to your ship and come aboard because they just don't want to die. So, yeah, in the circumstances where the ship's going down, I can well believe that an isolated pocket of the crew might decide we'd prefer to just surrender and survive. Elliot W. James asks, in later ironclads and early steel vessels, some warships had cofferdams as part of their internal subdivision. How effective were cofferdams? They had some effectiveness. So, for reference, most people, when they think of cofferdams, they're used to stuff like what was used to salvage USS Maine, or what's being used to preserve USS Olympia, where you essentially build a small concrete or steel or sometimes wooden dam around a ship or around a portion of a ship and pump the water out. But essentially a cofferdam is an enclosed watertight space at its most fundamental. So when you're talking about cofferdams inside ships, it's not well, unless you're talking in a damage control context, it's not going to be hastily assembled, you know, little barriers and so forth. A cofferdam as a structural part of an ironclad or an early pre-dreadnought in their subdivision essentially is, if you imagine, let's say, I mean, it's a bit early for oil firing, but let's say you've got the boiler room and then you've got the magazine ahead of the boiler room. Now, obviously, if there is an explosion in one or the other, hopefully not enough to set the magazine off anyway, but, a small scale one, maybe some scattering of fragments from a shell that's penetrated or something like that. If you have a single bulkhead and leaks in one, and that bulkhead gets ruptured, then obviously the next compartment over is going to also get full unless you can patch up the ruptured bulkhead. With a coffer dam, you essentially have a space. So if you think about a torpedo defense system, we have a liquid layer and a void layer. Essentially, a coffer dam is a void layer between two separate compartments of a ship. And that can run, like a wall or a bulkhead, or it can run underneath. You can have a horizontal coffer dam. And the idea of that is that even if there is some form of leak coming through from one compartment, whether that be through shrapnel or distorted frames and distorted plates and so forth, it won't get through to the next one because it will then leak into the cofferdam space, at which point then the other side of the cofferdam will preserve the ship's buoyancy. Now, obviously, that does presuppose that the force that is causing the leak in the first place is, relatively speaking, in terms of major damage to a ship, a gentle one, because if it's a really, really high velocity fragment, it's just punched straight through both. But even if it does punch straight through both, it might still buy you some time, because obviously water that's leaking into the cofferdam from the flooded compartment has to flood the cofferdam first before it can pour into the next compartment. So you might get some time to properly patch or plug the hole before the flooding reaches your next compartment. So they do have some useful benefit. The downside, though, is, as I said, major damage, like big shell explosions and that kind of thing, will tend to breach the cofferdams relatively easily unless you incorporate armoured bulkheads into them as well. And, of course, it's adding weight and occupying volume in the ship, which could be used for other things. So they are an idea. I wouldn't necessarily say they're a terrible idea, but they're also by far not the most efficient idea. Mon Squire asks, a few months back I asked your line of thought on the actions of Commander Lightoller and his actions towards German submarine sailors in the war after the sinking of their boat. I have been reading that the Royal Navy held similar views to the crews of Zeppelins. Zeppelin L-19 was shot down, its crew survived, but was refused help from the trawler King Stephen. At the time, she was serving as a Q ship, which should have placed her under Admiralty orders. While her crew were outnumbered by the German crew, to simply motor off leaving no aid and not contacting anyone in a timely fashion seems to be more than a lapse of judgment. What are your thoughts on this? Okay, so, well, I think two things. First, to clear up, King Stephen was not a Q ship at the time that L-17 was shot down. L-19, sorry, was shot down. She became a Q ship basically upon her return, which gives you some idea of what perhaps the Admiralty thought of the incident themselves. So, at the time of the Zeppelin coming down, King Stephen was a fishing trawler operating under civilian command and control. And then when she came back after the incident, that's when the Admiralty took her over and turned her into a Q ship. So it was very close proximity, but she wasn't under Admiralty orders. In fact, there's strong suggestions that she shouldn't have been in the area anyway at all, and this may have contributed to the whole incident because the Admiralty had declared certain areas off limits for fishing as basically too dangerous, like we're not going to come out and help you, that kind of stuff, and you might get run over by warships. But King Stephen, for whatever reason, was in that area. So there is some suggestion they may have wanted to try and conceal the fact that they were operating illegally. So, with that said, what do I think of King Stephen's actions of basically, well, let's break it down play by play. So they're operating probably illegally in restricted waters, but they see a distress signal. They decide to go off and investigate the distress signal, so that's good. They come across the wreckage of the L-19, and then according to the crew of the King Stephen, the captain decides that there are too many Germans compared to his very small crew on his trawler, and if he takes them off and puts them aboard his ship, then he thinks there's a high chance that they will attack his crew, overpower them, and sail the fishing trawler into Germany. and he doesn't want that, so he decides he's just going to leave. I do have a lot of problems with that. That is not, to me, an acceptable way of conducting yourself. Now, yes, obviously, if he brings a bunch of Germans back and they're interrogated and they say, well, where were you? And they work out this trawler was operating in illegal waters, yeah, he could be in trouble, and that is, an understandable concern. But one, you're talking about the lives of a lot of people versus, you could almost certainly play that, hey, I did a humanitarian thing, I didn't have to try and keep your fishing license if you're that worried about it. And secondly, given that they sighted distress signals and had to sail towards the Zeppelin for several hours, you could say that you were in perfectly legal waters, but you saw something on the horizon and you went to find out. There are ways around that concern that don't involve leaving a bunch of people to die. Now, in terms of the potential of the German crew overpowering you and sailing you into German waters, again, an understandable concern. However, apparently the German crew, were offering their word of honor that they would cooperate, and some of them even offered to pay for passage. And these days, yeah, that might not sound like too much either way, but, back in the early 20th century, while the idea of someone giving their word and sticking to it was beginning to fade out, it wasn't quite as strong a code as it had been, in the medieval period, for example, there still was quite a lot of weight behind someone giving their sworn word about something. And on top of that, you're a fishing trawler. If you were really that concerned, then rather than maybe going straight up to the wreckage and taking them off, where potentially they could swarm you, what you could do is maybe stand off 20 yards away and say to them, okay, you're going to come across 2, 3 at a time, brief swim in the North Sea. And if you're really concerned about them potentially overpowering you if you leave them out and around on deck, again, you're a trawler, you've got cargo holds for fish. Stick them in one of the cargo holds. They're going to be hard-pressed to get out of there, and I'm pretty sure, yeah, they might not appreciate being stuck in a cargo hold full with a bunch of dead fish, but they're going to appreciate it a heck of a lot more than being left on a slowly sinking Zeppelin in the middle of the North Sea at night. And then even if you don't want to do that, you could still, yes, a trawler is a small craft, but you should have some form of life-preserving equipment against the possibility of your ship being sunk, whether that's a small boat or life jackets or something like that, supplies, etc. Even if you're absolutely not going to take these people aboard under any circumstances, no matter what they say, you could at least leave them with something to help them stay afloat that, that's not a sinking Zeppelin. Or again, if you don't want them on the ship, but you maybe have a ship's boat, put them on the ship's boat and tow them. Because then if any of them, well, I was going to say if any of them try to then get on board, but, if you're a trawler, even if you're motoring along at 6, 7 knots, someone who's in a boat being towed behind you on the end of a length of rope, they are physically not going to be able to swim off of that boat to overhaul and catch you up. So you would be safe. So while there are understandable concerns about just taking on, almost 20 Germans, they are not the kind of concerns where you turn around and say, actually, no, stuff you, I'm going to leave you to drown. Now, balanced against that, you do have to remember that this was the first war of aerial bombardment, the first war of indiscriminate aerial bombardment against civilians. There was a huge amount of hate for Zeppelin crews at the time. And personally, I think that most of the excuses that the crew of the King Stephen gave pretty much ring hollow for all the reasons I've just outlined. Personally, I think that they just looked at the Zeppelin crew and decided they didn't like them because of what they represented and what they had supposedly done, and they were going to decide to be judge, jury, and executioner. I think that's actually what they did. Now, of course, given the novelty and the horror at the time of bombarding civilians and women and children with bombs from the air at random, given the attitudes that that entailed, it is understandable that they might have done that. But, as I pointed out many times before, just because you can understand why somebody did something and, you can come up with an explanation as to why they did something, just understanding it doesn't make it acceptable. So, yeah, I can understand why the crew of the King Stephen might have done this. I still fundamentally disagree with them actually going through with it. Because, as I said, there are a lot of options that didn't involve essentially murdering almost 20 people who really did not deserve that fate, no matter what you might think of them. Library of Context asks, I've noticed that on many of the photos of US Navy vessels that you've used, while they're flying a US flag, i.e. the stars and stripes, the ships are also flying another pennant, a dark square with a field of stars. What is this pennant or flag? Well, here's a good example. This is the USS New Mexico. You can see right aft, she's got the stars and stripes flying off the fantail, but on the bow, she has this pretty much square pennant that's dark background and a bunch of stars. Well, this additional flag, it's not quite square, it's almost square, but it is actually slightly rectangular. This is the Jack of the United States. So this is a Jack flag, and this is flown while moored by any ship that is under the employ of the US government. So obviously the US Navy flies it, but so do the Coast Guard. Theoretically, US Army ships would do. The various US scientific branches, so NOAA, National Ocean and Atmospheric Administration. I guess if NASA had ships, they would do it as well. It's basically while the ship is moored, signifying that it is a American ship in the employ of the US government. And when the ship is moving, it's not flown. So if you see this flag deployed, that's a good indication that the ship that's being photographed at that point is either at anchor or someone's forgotten to take the jack down. But that's relatively speaking unlikely. Slightly confusingly, it's also known as the Union Jack, which makes sense because it is obviously the Union, the United States of America, and it's the Jack of the United States, so it is the Jack of the Union, it is the Union Jack. But of course, the more commonly known across the world Union Jack is the flag of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. And before anyone jumps in and says, oh, actually, it should be called the Union flag. No, actually, the experts in flags and coats of arms, and yes, there are such things, have actually declared that for the British flag, Union Jack or Union flag is actually applicable regardless of whether you're using it in a naval context, on a flagpole on land, or at any other point. So, both colloquially and officially, there are in fact two Union Jacks. There's this one, and there's the more commonly known one, which is the one that is also the national flag of the United Kingdom. Scott Jennings asks, you've previously mentioned examples where the British Treasury, being penny wise and pound foolish, has made decisions that not only left the Royal Navy weaker than it should be at a critical juncture, but also ended up costing Britain more money in the long run than it would have spent if it had gone with the Navy's preferred option. In the interest of fairness, are there any examples of Treasury penny pinching with regard to the Royal Navy's budget that you feel were correct in the long run? Or maybe examples where Treasury decisions were correct at the time, given what was known, but due to changing circumstances or information they didn't have to hand, later proved to be suboptimal. Okay, so I can give you an example of one of each, and, much as I do like to rag on the Treasury almost as much as, or perhaps more than I like to rag on Beatty, and actually, to be fair, the Treasury does deserve an awful lot of ragging on because it's compromised British national security and defence so many times. Even a broken clock is right twice a day. So, circumstances where the Treasury made the right call or seemed to make the right call, one would be in the early 1860s. That's why you got HMS Duke of Wellington here. So there was a naval arms race already going on before the launch of Gloire and Warrior, because they were actually part of this naval race, between Britain and France. And that had started back with conventional sail ships of the line, then it had gone through steam ships of the line, now it was onto ironclads. And as a result, there were quite a lot of wooden capital ships, various ships of the line, first, second rate, etc., on the stocks when along comes Gloire and Warrior and obviates that particular strategy of capital ship construction. Now, some in the Royal Navy pressed for scrapping or breaking up all of them and just focusing on ironclads from now on. Others wanted to keep some of them around and convert them into ironclads, so wooden hull ironclad warships. And still others wanted to keep building wooden warships, wooden capital ships specifically, in conjunction with the ironclads, because they didn't necessarily trust the ironclad design that it would work out at all, and others thought that maybe we can't build enough of them, so we're still going to need these other wooden warships. And the Treasury at that point stepped in and said, hang on a minute, you know, these ironclads are pretty darn expensive, and you know, if you want us to fund that, okay, but you can't expect us to fund essentially 2 full battle fleets, one full of ironclads, one full of wooden warships, especially considering there's a good chance that the wooden warship is now out of date. And so they ended up with a compromise, which was basically the ships that were closest to completion, where it would actually cost less to complete them than it would to scrap them, they got completed. Some others did get converted, but a good number that were, you know, only part way to completion were just broken up. The Treasury refused to pay for them. And that was ultimately the right call, because there would be precious little point in spending, you know, 1861, 62, 63, building more wooden warships to launch them, commission them in the 1864, 1865, at a point where even some of the earliest ironclads were beginning to be downrated by the launch of more recent ones. So that was a correct, an objectively correct call. And another one, which is the sort of second one, which was decisions that were correct at the time given what was known, but turned out to be suboptimal, I think would be the suspension of capital ship construction at the start of World War I. Because obviously, objectively, given how long the war lasted, it was a mistake. You know, even if you'd reduced capital ship construction from the sort of 6 to 8 per year down to maybe 2 battleships and a battle cruiser per year, or 2 and 2, or something along those lines. Objectively, from a perspective looking back now, they should have continued with at least some capital ship construction. But at the time that war was declared, Britain had a very large surplus of ships. They had a lot of other ships that they could acquire. And while there had been very long wars in the past, in the Age of Sail and so forth, all the evidence of more recent conflicts, whether that be the Franco-Prussian War, the Spanish-American War, the Russo-Japanese War, etc., seemed to indicate that a modern war, especially a modern war that involves some kind of naval element, at least that wasn't a continental scale civil war like the American Civil War, would probably be decided and done and dusted and over with within a couple of years at most, if not sooner. And in those circumstances, any capital ship that was then, you know, being laid down in late 1914 would be completed after the war was over, so it wouldn't materially have any effect on the war itself, but it would take up money, resources, workers, and dockyard space. Whereas smaller craft, submarines, destroyers, small cruisers, could be built instead, and you'd get those out, and they might actually have an effect on the war. Plus, of course, ships are going to be damaged, and you'd free up work crews to repair damaged vessels. So, based on their understanding of what modern conflict looked like at that point, it did make a certain amount of sense to suspend capital ship construction. Their mistake, I think, was once it became clear that the war wasn't really going anywhere by the end of 1914, or at least it wasn't going anywhere fast, was not resuming capital ship construction at that stage. Duke Master asks, the common shorthand for Jutland is that it was a tactical German victory but a strategic British victory, with one side inflicting greater casualties, but the other retaining control of the field. How much worse would it have needed to be for the Grand Fleet to have its "we've maintained the blockade" line no longer be sufficient cover for the battle's outcome? You would have needed some significant loss to the Grand Fleet itself, because, I mean, as I've pointed out in my own Jutland video, Jutland is really a game of two halves. The battle cruiser engagement, BT versus Hipper wins that hands down. The fleet engagement of Jellicoe versus Scheer, Jellicoe wins that hands down. Now, if you want to flip that over to the British losing both, then you have to inflict disproportionate losses on the British battle line. And especially considering, obviously, as you said, the British ultimate objective is to maintain the blockade, you need to compromise their ability to maintain the blockade. The easiest way that could happen, I could imagine, would be perhaps when Scheer orders his torpedo boats in for a mass assault, Jellicoe historically turns away, and as a result, as a net result of all the German torpedo attacks, only Marlborough is ever hit, and not in that first wave. And Marlborough's not hit fatally. Now, if Jellicoe had, say, turned in towards the torpedoes, which some people think he should have done, obviously he runs more of a risk of getting hit. Now, there's nothing that strictly suggests he would get hit by significantly larger numbers of torpedoes, but let's say that he does turn into the torpedoes, and let's say that somebody slightly misjudges the angle of the incoming torpedo. So instead of turning and running straight at the torpedoes, the ground fleet turns and runs at, 20, 30 degrees off of the torpedoes' line of advance, thus making them a much easier target. And a whole bunch of British battleships get hit by said torpedoes. And, let's be realistic. If you've got that many torpedoes coming in and a bunch of ships getting hit, let's say 2 or 3 battleships are either sunk or damaged beyond repair, either sinking not immediately, but sinking that day or sinking on the way back, having to be abandoned, and let's say half a dozen more are badly damaged. So net, you've taken, 10 British battleships off the front line. Well, now you've actually, between that and and Hipper's trouncing of Beatty, you actually evened up the odds for a rerun. Now the Grand Fleet and the High Seas Fleet is either at kind of numerical parity, or perhaps even the High Seas Fleet might even have numerical superiority, depending on exactly what the casualties are. That would mean that it's now no longer sustainable to hold the blockade, because if the High Seas Fleet sails to challenge the blockade, there's a reasonable chance that the Grand Fleet might not be able to defend against said challenge, at which point the whole, we've kept the blockade going, falls apart. W. Osterberg asks, what is your preferred scale model to build and paint? Before my visual issues occurred, I always liked 1:700 and 1:3000. I think it depends what I'm trying to do. If I was trying to do a naval war game, paint miniatures for that, then I tend to prefer either 1:1200 or 1:2400. Now, that might sound a little bit odd, but 1:1200 in my mind gives you just enough detail to focus in on those details while still getting a reasonable sized fleet. 1:2400 gives you the opportunity to have a pretty large fleet but still have the ships fairly distinct. 1:1800, which some naval war games come in at, it can work for some earlier periods, but certainly if you're doing 1:1800 for the 20th century, I personally don't think it works, because the scale to me is just a little bit too big to have truly large fleets on the table, but it's also just a little bit too small to get the finer details in, but it looks like you'll get the finer details in, which can be very deceptive. But that's the wargaming stuff. If you're going to absolutely go ham on, I'm going to have as many ships as humanly possible, and you want to actually refight Jutland, then either 1:3000 or 1:6000, depending on what size table you've got. And then coming back up the other way, I think 1:700 for me works for older ships, because a 1:700 scale, let's say 19th century and earlier ship, that's the kind of thing you can have sitting on a shelf in front of some books and it looks good but doesn't take up too much space. For me, 1:700 in 20th century shipping is actually, again, a little bit of an awkward one, because it's just large enough to have lots of details and small parts, but just small enough that a lot of those details and small parts are fiddly. You know, at one point, I did do an Iowa class, and yes, at one point I actually put every single 20mm. Those 20mm things are so flippin' tiny. And you'd use the tiniest dab of glue because you don't want it to dissolve all the paintwork you've just done on it. And then, you know, 5 years later, when you jog the thing and 70 or 80 single 20mm Orlikans the size of half a grain of rice go bouncing all over the floor, you wonder what the point of it all was. So, yeah, if you're going to do 20th century stuff, I prefer 1 to 350. So, generally speaking, it kind of comes in pairs, where the smaller scale of the various pairs I tend to think works better for 19th century and earlier stuff, and for 20th century and I suppose 21st century stuff, if anyone wants to paint a low polygon grey blob, then you really want the slightly larger scale, because then the model becomes a lot larger, and suddenly not only is there a lot of detail, but the detail is actually, you know, you can paint it without needing fine scale tweezers or ruining your eyesight. Jack Hirsch asks, could the radio beacons that US Navy pilots used to find their way back to their ships in late World War II be considered the forerunner of the modern ILS approaches that modern jetliners use? And how did they make their radio beacons go in a straight line in World War II? Well, here you can see a carrier island from World War II, and right at the top where it says, well, it looks like it says Ye Aircraft Homing System. It's actually the YE Aircraft Homing System on what's known as a hay rake antenna. You can kind of see how you get the radio beam not necessarily go in a completely straight line, but to go in, you know, a cone in the direction you want it to go in. You have a curved transmission antenna. You can actually see a very similar system working on the 2 Mark IV fire control radars further down. And for that matter, the SP search radar. It's all about antenna shaping, essentially. Now, is it the direct forerunner of the modern ILS approaches systems on jetliners? No, actually. Weirdly enough, if there's any system in World War II that could be notionally seen as a forerunner of the modern ILS system that jetliners used to land in bad weather, it's actually the German bombing aiming systems that they used in the Blitz. So what the Germans would do is they would transmit one stream of radio signals towards the target. So you would fly along this radio beam listening in, and that meant you were heading towards your target. And obviously if the signal got weaker, then you'd steer to make sure it got stronger again, and that way you knew you were heading in the right direction. And then they'd have a separate beam which would be transmitting at an angle ideally as close to perpendicular as possible. And they had it calculated such that the crossover of the two beams occurred over the target. So you'd be flying along, and then when you hear this second signal, that's, you know, you have to drop your bombs. And that way, theoretically, you don't need to see the target. And, I mean, well, given the level of, you know, dispersion on the radio signals and the calculation methods that were possible at the time, as long as you were targeting something about the size of a city, you'd be roughly in the right ballpark. As far as I understand it, the modern ILS systems actually use a very similar approach of overlapping beams. And so as the aircraft flies down a series of overlapping beams, it goes, well, you know, I can hear this beam at, let's say, 70% strength and this beam at 30% strength. Right, I need to turn the aircraft towards the one that's at 30% strength until it hears both of them at about equal strength, because then it knows it's basically passed through a chevron of radio signal, and at the center point, that's where it needs to be. Then you have the next intersecting section, and so on and so forth. So you're basically passing down a series of chevron peaks. At least that's as far as I believe the modern ILS system works. The US system, which you can see here, works on a slightly different principle. So as the antenna rotates and sweeps the sky, every 30 degrees that it sweeps through, it would transmit a different letter in Morse code. And so obviously you've got 360 degrees divided up into 30-degree segments. So that gives you 12 segments. And in each segment, as I said, it transmits a different letter in Morse code. So they would change these up quite regularly, but the pilots would be briefed on the day what the various letters are for the various arcs. So if you're then flying along in your aircraft and you think, I need to find my way home, you listen for a Morse code transmission, and let's say you hear S, so ... And you look on your map and you see, okay, the letter S is currently designated to the last segment, so 330 to 360 degrees. So I know I am almost directly north of the carrier, a little bit sort of northwest. So therefore, I need to turn basically south. And if I'm going along and suddenly I'm not hearing the ... of S anymore, and maybe I'm hearing ... of O, and then I look at my little chart and I see that O is assigned to the first segment, so 0 to 30 degrees. Okay, so I know I've now drifted slightly east of the north of the carrier. So that means I'm drifting to port, and therefore I'm off target for my approach. So now I need to steer to starboard until I hear the ... again. And similarly for whatever letter might be in the 300 to 330 degree margin. So you can ideally keep a roughly straight course heading towards the carrier, and if you're off course, you'll kind of zigzag, and as you get closer and closer, obviously, though, that width that is described by the 30-degree arc gets less, and you gradually end up homing in on the carrier. So that's the US way of doing it. And the British way of doing it was different yet again. It used a similar system to the US in that it had a rotating beam that transmitted signal, but instead of transmitting separate letters so that you had to consult your map and work out where exactly everything was, it was a little bit of a simpler system because it was available right from the very beginning of the war. And it was simply that you would have synchronized your watch with a master clock or master watch aboard the carrier when you left, and the antenna would be rotating through 360 degrees in such a way that at the top of the minute, as the minute switches from one to the other, that antenna is always pointing directly north. So as it sweeps around, at 15 seconds through the minute, the antenna is always pointing east. At 30 seconds, it's pointing south, and so on and so forth. And so you would listen on your headphones for the little signal as it sweeps around, because it's a very discrete, very narrow band signal. And when you hear the signal in your radio transmission headphones, you look at your watch and you go, I heard that signal 20 seconds past the minute. Now, assuming that your watch has stayed in sync, that tells you that you are east-southeast of the carrier. So then you steer a reciprocal bearing west-northwest, and you'll head towards the carrier. And then in theory, as long as you're heading in a straight line, at 20 seconds past each minute, you will keep hearing a beep in your headset. And if you hear it at 15 seconds past the hour, you have gone slightly to the right. And if you hear it at 25 seconds past the hour, you've gone slightly too far to the left. And again, you can alter your course. So the US and British systems work on a vaguely similar principle, but it's a little bit different in practice. Reichspeer Minister asks, how much of a factor was material fatigue in shipbuilding and ship design during the 18th century up to World War II? See, the weird thing is, at least to modern ears, material fatigue was much, much less of an issue in the 18th and early 19th century, and it became more and more of an issue in the late 19th and going into the 20th century. And you might think, well, hang on a minute. Is that to do with the iron and steel as opposed to wood or anything like that? No, it's actually to do, bizarrely enough, with the science of shipbuilding getting more precise. Because material fatigue, things like wood rotting, masts being sprung, that kind of stuff, that was always a problem. And it was something that was recognized, something that had to be dealt with. But because the calculations for things like complex structures and what we would today call safety factors and everything were much less refined in the 18th and early 19th centuries, people tended to take the approach of, which I appreciate generally most of the time as an engineer, of when it comes to safety, overbuild stuff, as long as you can, as long as you're not massively compromising a ship's performance. And so material fatigue in and of itself, in the way that would become an issue later on, wasn't really so much a thing because the stuff was just so heavily overbuilt it didn't matter. I mean, yeah, even by the mid-19th century, look at the Great Eastern. You know, that thing was subjected to all sorts of horrific stresses and strains and forces, basically rode almost all of them out because it was just so massively overbuilt. It really didn't care. But as you get into the latter part of the 19th century and then into the 20th century, now you're building ships with iron and then with steel, and they're getting bigger, and the materials that you're making it out of require a lot more preparation, a lot more investment, therefore they're more expensive. Not to mention, obviously, because there's just more of them, because the ship is larger, you're also spending more money. And therefore, the price of any individual ship is actually becoming proportionally much, much more of an issue than, you know, relatively speaking, compared to smaller price variations of earlier ships. That means it's much, much more dependent upon you to make sure that your design is efficient and saves money and is lighter weight. And also you have things like, obviously, now you're using steam engines. For every ton that your ship weighs, you're having to pay for coal or later oil to propel your ship. That costs money. And the heavier the ship is, the more powerful the machinery plant you need. And the more powerful the machinery plant is, the more fuel it's going to burn. So a ship that is massively overbuilt in an ironclad or steel ship context is one that's going to be massively difficult to run, expensive to run, because it's going to burn a lot more fuel than it needs to. It's going to need a much larger, more expensive machinery plant. It's going to need more crew for the machinery. As a result, it's not going to be able to carry as much cargo. If it's a civilian ship, it's not going to be able to carry as many guns or as much armour, ammunition, etc. if it's a military ship. And so suddenly that specific element of efficiency has become way, 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 way more important. And that's just some of the factors as to why it's now a lot more important than it used to be. And then also factor in the advance of science, which allows you to calculate a lot more precisely what's going on in terms of the stresses and strains on your ship and where they are and what loads it can withstand and how much you can cut down your structural members and your hull plating before it starts to become dangerously unsafe. And now suddenly you're building ships where they still have safety factors and tolerances, but the safety factors and tolerances are much, much closer to the yield strength of the materials that you're using than Age of Sail ship of the line, for example, or the Great Eastern. And because of that, because the point of failure for your ship is now much, much closer to the daily stresses and strains it experiences, now you're getting metal fatigue an awful lot faster and cropping up in an awful lot more places. And ultimately, you're still doing all of this by hand, so there can be errors that creep in. And so you can end up with overstress points in places you weren't expecting because someone forgot to carry the 1 or misplaced a decimal point or something like that. And yeah, suddenly material fatigue becomes a whole different ballgame. I mean, there's also, to a certain extent, the material as well. You know, a wooden ship, if, you know, some of the timbers start to give way, you can nail the timbers together, you can lash the ship together, you can patch holes with on-demand timber. Damage control on a wooden ship, as long as it's not on fire, is a relatively straightforward affair in terms of working out what you need to do and can you actually fix it at all. Whereas if you're on a steel ship and you get the equivalent, a hull plate, for example, becoming overstressed, if a hull plate just shears, shatters, cracks, you may not have the capability to fix that, period. You know, your best solution at that point would be contain the breach and just hope it doesn't spread. And that's a lot more catastrophic than a similar failure on a wooden ship. Smelly Kaka asks, the Kriegsmarine had a typical policy for their capital ships of avoiding anything remotely approaching a fair fight. No doubt the Royal Navy would be able to infer this from observation, but to what extent did they know this by more concrete means? If we take Operation Rheinebug, for example, where Lutyens had explicit orders to this effect, If the Royal Navy knew about this policy, how might they have responded differently compared to if they didn't know, or vice versa? As far as I'm aware, I don't think the Royal Navy ever had absolute concrete evidence that the Germans had a policy of avoid any fight other than one that is so hilariously one-sided you cannot help but to win. And if they ever had any possible intelligence along those lines, I don't think they would have actually believed it. Because ultimately, most Royal Navy officers, now there were a few exceptions in the higher echelons of command, but most Royal Navy officers on the front lines, everyone from the lowest sailor all the way up to fleet admirals, in the Royal Navy generally had a policy of enemy has shown up, therefore we shall fight enemy. And if enemy has shown up in large numbers, we shall charge enemy because it gets us get closer and we might be able to kill more of them before we're overwhelmed. Also, they might not realise we're alone. Basically, the Royal Navy's policy when it came to engaging at disproportionate odds was there is no such thing as disproportionate odds, there's just more targets. The only times there were exceptions to that would be essentially where either you could make the fight disproportionate in your favour by means of a brief tactical retreat, which you see quite a lot happening in the Mediterranean against the Regia Marina, or if it was a case of there is nothing that is meaningfully served by this fight, i.e. you have a means of escape and it's extremely unlikely that you're actually going to be able to do anything to your opponent. Whereas if you don't have a means of escape, or there's a chance you might be able to do some meaningful damage, you engage. So, to the Royal Navy's mind, being confronted by something that vaguely approximates a fair fight and declining it just does not compute. Why would you decline a fight that you've got a reasonable chance you might win? And so you do sometimes see this reflected in certain narratives and dispatches from various captains at the scene of various engagements, where they seem almost befuddled by the fact the Germans seem to prefer to just turn tail and run. They're just sort of sitting there going, but why? He might have been able to do some damage. He might have been able to sink my ship. But why did he run? This doesn't make sense. They must be cowards. Or something really weird must be going on. And then that was thrown out by the occasional German captain who actually bothered to try and fight somebody. And then they're like, oh, okay, so it's not all of them. But in any case, if the Royal Navy had had hard, concrete evidence that the Germans were going to try and steer away from and steer clear of anything vaguely approximating an actual straight-up fight, I think you would have seen a lot more deceptive tactics in two formats. Where something was absolutely vital that had to get through, I could then see the Royal Navy just going, look, okay, what would be an approximately fair fight for the worst threat that the Germans could possibly put out here? We will put that on these convoys. And if we don't have that, we'll disguise something so it looks like that. So, maybe good old Iron Duke and Centurion, I mean, they already dressed them up to look vaguely like King George V. I can actually see if the Royal Navy is really desperate, they need to get this convoy through. They think maybe the Scharnhorsts are out there somewhere. They don't have enough actual battleships to cover all the convoys. I can very much see them going, okay, both of you are now pretending to be King George V, and we're putting you on convoy escort duty. Because if you're the Scharnhorst and you come over the horizon and you see what looks very definitely like a King George V class battleship sitting on escort, you're going and turning away, and thus mission accomplished as far as the Royal Navy is concerned. So that's one form of deception. The other form of deception I can see them trying to pull off would be essentially parading a very, very, very understrength inviting target. Sort of going, yeah, well, essentially through the leaked intelligence or letting German aerial recon go through or creative use of double agents, essentially going, oh, it's such a crying shame. There's this really important convoy and it's full of vital goods and materials, but it absolutely has to go now because the recipient needs it, but we don't have the escorts. We're going to stick maybe a Leander and a few destroyers on there and hope for the best. They can deal with a Hilfskreuzer, but please don't let a Hipper or a Scharnhorst come after that convoy. We'll be really, really stuffed if that happens. Make sure that gets to the Germans. and, you know, sit just over the horizon with a battle cruiser or a carrier or both, and maybe a fast battleship, and just go, yes, yes, we know you don't like fair fights. Here's a very, very unfair fight. You know, something that's ripe for the plucking. Please, please, come and try and kill it. We really would like you to. Meanwhile, hiding with overwhelming force, as I say, just waiting for the Germans to put a foot wrong. Gabriel A. Hawkins asks, much ink has been spilt concerning Washington Treaty violations of the Japanese Navy in terms of the size of their ships, yet I've read very little about the Japanese Navy's most remarkable apparent violation, an entire battle cruiser. Wasn't Hiei supposed to be demilitarized or scrapped? How did the Japanese get away with that one? Were there any other ships that have been purportedly demilitarized and then happened to make pretty notable appearances in a subsequent war? So this all comes about from the London Naval Treaty, the first one. So right at the top of the first London Naval Treaty in Article 2, it lists a whole series of capital ships that are to be disposed of. So the US has to get rid of Florida, Utah, and then either Arkansas or Wyoming. Obviously, they choose Wyoming. The UK has to get rid of Benbow, Iron Duke, Marlborough, Emperor of India, and Tiger. And the Japanese have to get rid of Hiei. And then if you go this Article 1, Article 2, Section 1, Subsection A, but then Subsection B, of the ships to be disposed of under this article, the following may be retained for training purposes. In the United States, Arkansas or Wyoming, as we said, they picked Wyoming for that. For the UK, Iron Duke, and for Japan, Hiei. These ships shall be reduced to the condition prescribed in Section 5 of Annex 2 of Part 2 of the present treaty. So let's go there. So in that section, it says, in addition to the rights already possessed by any high contracting party under the Washington Treaty, each high contracting party is permitted to retain for training purposes exclusively the following vessels. Obviously, we've mentioned those. Part B, vessels retained for training purposes under the provisions of paragraph 8 shall, within 6 months of the date on which they are required to be disposed of, be dealt with as follows. So for capital ships, the following is to be carried out. Removal of main armament guns, revolving parts of all barbettes and turrets, machinery for operating turrets, but 3 turrets with their armament may be retained in each ship. 2. Removal of all ammunition and explosives in excess of the quantity required for target practice training for the guns remaining on board. 3. Removal of the conning tower and the side armour belt between the foremast and aftmost barbettes. 4. Removal or mutilation of all torpedo tubes. And 5. Removal or mutilation of all boilers in excess of the number required for a maximum speed of 18 knots. And in the picture, you can see Hiei in her guise as a training ship in the early 1930s. And you'll notice she still has her 2 forward turrets. She has her immediate aft turret, but the aftmost turret is gone. There's just a little house placed on top of that. So they have, in fact, complied with Part 1. They've removed the main armament guns, revolving parts of all barbettes, turrets, machinery for operating the turrets, but they're allowed to leave 3 on board. So they've taken off the 4th. That's fine. They've taken off all the explosives except for making it a training ship. The conning tower is gone. You can see that up front. And you can see down the side, the big hollow where the belt armour was. That's all gone. Torpedo tubes, obviously you can't see that, but yes, also no longer functional. And yes, they took out some boilers. So yeah, they converted Hiei into a training ship. The thing is, this section, it tells you what you need to do, and then Part C, the last section, just says, undertakes that the vessels retained in accordance with the provisions of this section shall not be used for any combatant purpose. That bit, obviously, they ignored later on. But what the British and the Americans did is obviously they took stuff off and then they got rid of it. The Japanese, once they took the armour off, they took out the the turret and everything, they just stored them in a warehouse. So all the stuff you needed to make Hiei a full battle cruiser again was just stored off ashore, and Hiei was fully treaty compliant until they decided to pull her in and refit her, similar to her sister ships, at which point they weren't following the treaty anymore, and they just broke all the stuff that they had stored away out of the warehouse, put it back on, plus the various upgrades, obviously, you know, replacing and upgrading all the machinery anyway, and Hiei was back again as a battle cruiser. Theoretically, the US could have done that with Wyoming, and the British could have done that with Iron Duke if they'd thought to retain all the various bits and pieces, but of course they hadn't. But the thing is, the treaty didn't strictly say that you had to dispose of those things, and so the Japanese hadn't done so. Lofferton Henderson asks, if we aren't going to get a full video on Drax all-forward Royal Navy timeline, boo, will of the people, boo, can we get an overview here? Well, you know, never say never, because I might do a video on my hypothetical all-forward timeline at some point in any case. But as a brief primer, this started as a thought experiment when I was looking through the various considerations for the construction of the Revenge class. And as some of you may know, the Royal Navy had an on-again, off-again relationship with the idea of having triple turrets all the way as far back as the Bellerophon and St. Vincent classes. So it wasn't that the technology was completely unknown to them, or that British manufacturers couldn't make one, it's just the Royal Navy didn't particularly want one. However, in my alternate timeline, when they're looking at the Revenge class and they want a smaller, more compact 15-inch gun ship, i.e. a smaller, cheaper version of the Queen Elizabeths to serve in the battle line, somebody clever hits on the idea of, okay, if we use 3 triples instead of 4 twins, we can shorten the overall length of the ship because the citadel will be shorter. You know, we won't need as much length of the ship dedicated to armament, and we get +1 gun, which is good. Now, historically, that got shot down over concerns about reliability, but this time it gets accepted. And then someone else, possibly, or maybe the same person, goes, hang on a minute, if we want this citadel to be as compact as possible, saving as much weight and as much cost as possible, given that we're going to be attacking with a very large fleet and the enemy's going to be running away, what if we put all the guns forward? And then we compact the citadel even more. So basically the reasoning that historically would bring about the Nelsons a little bit later on. And somebody goes, oh, I like this. So we're getting an extra 15-inch gun compared to the QEs, and we're really going to be able to squeeze this into a very small, compact, efficient frame, which means we can possibly have more of them. I like this idea. And so the Revenge class basically end up looking like miniature Nelsons, except obviously with 15-inch guns. And then somebody goes, okay, well, we're building them. And then World War I happens, and then they cancel Renown, Repulse, and Resistance, and then someone, well, Fisher goes, well, I want some battle cruisers, and I go, well, we've got the materials left over for the Renown, Repulse, and Resistance, so Fisher goes, okay, well, how about we do a battle cruiser version, which we'll have 6 guns, so we'll just have 2 triple turrets, one super firing above the other, in the manner of our Revenge class, and then we can use that saved volume to have more machinery, obviously stretch the hull out a bit, refine it a little bit, and hey, we've got a 6-gun Renown class all-forward battle cruiser, which at that point is kind of like a triple turret version of a Dunkirk. And then, of course, when it comes to Hood, everyone's going, yeah, this weight-saving malarkey is quite fun with the all-forward armament idea. And, I mean, battle cruisers being fast, they're going to chase people down. So when the idea for Hood comes around to the Admiral class, they go, well, you know, why don't we just put that 15 back in, make it even longer, we can stick a nice secondary armament out back for, you know, fighting destroyers and so forth, and then we can have an all-forward 9-gun battle cruiser. And that's what you see here. This was kind of actually the first one I knocked up as a concept in Ultimate Admiral Dreadnoughts. This is an all-forward Hood. And now, having established a design pattern going forward, the British is like, yeah, all-forward is fun. We will do all-forward for basically anything particularly large. So, of course, the Nelsons naturally would be all-forward. The counties end up being 3 triple 8-inch all-forward. I did think about doing Tone-style 4 twin 8s, but decided, no, that's silly. So they end up with 3 triple 8s up forward and then a nice big expanse of flight operations area aft. And so it goes on. But yes, that's a very brief summary of some of the starting elements of my all-forward timeline. So yeah, basically almost all British cruisers and capital ships from the Revenge class onward become all-forward gun vessels, which makes them lovely and efficient, which pleases my inner engineer. Grummancat asks, going back to USS Vesuvius, could the projectiles have been rifled to improve accuracy, or is the problem entirely down to the stability of the host ship itself? I don't think rifling is going to help all that much, to be perfectly honest. For one thing, the air pressure involved isn't giving you anywhere near as much force as conventional guns. And that's kind of reflected in the overall range, despite the elevation of Vesuvius's dynamite guns. So adding more friction is just going to drop your range, even if theoretically you'll have some spin-stabilized shells that might be a little bit more accurate. The problem with the accuracy of Vesuvius, although the guns being fixed guns and therefore the ship rolling and pitching would affect your accuracy, that is something of a problem. That can be mitigated to a certain degree just by either keeping the ship in calm water or keeping the ship steered on a course or something like that. The larger issue with the accuracy of Vesuvius's guns is their source of power, the pneumatic air system. Because as you use it, the temperature of the system changes, and the temperature significantly affects the overall pressure of compressed gases, plus, of course, the environment Vesuvius is operating in, whether it's warm waters, cold waters, warm environment, cold environment, high pressure day, low pressure day, all of that will affect the relative power of the air pressure flasks using the technology of the day. And that is really the single biggest issue when it comes to Vesuvius and accuracy. So unless you resolve that, unfortunately, you're not going to really ever make her particularly accurate. In theory, you could try and resolve it by perhaps massively insulating the entire pneumatic system for the dynamite guns and trying to hold that all in a temperature-regulated and controlled environment. That would mitigate the external factors to a certain degree, but it's still not going to change, differences in atmospheric pressure, and it's also not going to change the fact that once you've fired the thing, there's going to be a huge drop in temperature within the system. And you're either going to have to just sit there and wait for it all to warm up, or the next time you fire it, your range is going to be somewhat different to when you fired it the first time. Robert Ohlweiler asks, it seems that the 12-inch 50 caliber gun was very much in vogue circa 1910 through 1912, and the US, British, Germans and Russians all built capital ships armed with them. But despite being the same bore and caliber, there are some pretty huge differences in the performance of the guns of the various nations, which leads me to believe that these differences probably have more to do with the shells than the guns themselves. So my question is, what was everyone doing differently with their shell designs? Who did the most right, the most wrong, and what led to their design choices for their shells? Well, there were some differences in the guns as well. There are all notionally 12-inch 50, or in the case of the Russians, 12-inch 52, but because of the way different nations measure their guns, some measure the full length of the gun, some measure the full length of the gun but not including the breech, some only measure the internal length of the barrel but include the chamber, others only include the rifled section of the gun. So when you look at the four nations that you mentioned, the bore length, i.e. the bit of the gun that the shell actually travels down, is just under 14.5 meters on the German gun, just about 15.25 meters on the British gun. It's about just under 14.5 meters on the Russian gun, and it's just a fraction over 15 meters on the American gun. So there are some slight differences just in the gun length. And then there's the twist of the rifling. The lowest amount is on the German gun, which starts out as a 1 in 45 twist, although it increases to 1 in 30. The British is a uniform 1 in 30. The Russian is a uniform 1 in 30. And the American one is either a 1 in 25 or a 1 in 50, increasing to 1 in 32, depending on which model of the gun you're looking at. And then others have a 1 in 32 section. So actually the shallowest twist is actually on the American one, for that matter. And then you've also obviously also got the construction method. Is it hooped? Is it wire wound? Exactly how are you constructing it in either case? So the guns, although they're all notionally 12-inch 50s, there are some reasonable differences between each gun type. But when we come on to the shells, they are all quite different. So in ascending order of weight, using the original APC shell for each gun, the British gun, the APC shell is just a fraction under 860 pounds. The American gun is 870 pounds on its AP round. The German APC round is 893 pounds, near enough. And the Russian gun has the heaviest APC round at 1,038 pounds. But the order slightly changes when you look at the length of the shell. So the British have the shortest APC shell at 38 inches, then the Germans with a 40.8-inch shell, then the Americans with a 42-inch long shell, and the Russians have a shell that's somewhat over 46 inches. So the Russians have the longest and heaviest shell out of everybody. And then the order switches around yet again if you're looking at how much propellant is actually being used. Now, of course, everyone uses their own type of propellant in terms of what explosive they're using, but the Germans have the smallest propellant charge of just over 276 pounds of explosive. The British use 307 pounds of explosive. The Americans use 337 pounds of explosive, and the Russians, once again, are at the top with 346 pounds of explosive. So, if you want to look at shells, the Russians have the heaviest shell, the longest shell, being propelled by the largest amount of explosive through the longest barrel gun. Therefore, it's perhaps hardly surprising that their shells tend to go further and hit harder. Now, there are also going to be things with, the exact design of the windshield for the shell and so forth. But I think just that examination demonstrates exactly why the Russian guns tended to overall just be the best of the long barrel 12-inch. Steam Mean Fighting Machine asks, when comparing British and American aircraft carriers, the focus is often on armoured carriers, but how does the Ark Royal of the 1930s rate in comparison to the Yorktowns? Do you feel that either design has a significant advantage or disadvantage? It's quite interesting, actually, because both carriers do have significant advantages over each other, and which ones you think are the most important really depends, I suppose, on where you're going to be operating and what you think is most valuable for a World War II carrier. So if we look at the Yorktowns have a somewhat larger air group. They're designed for around about 90 aircraft, whereas Ark Royal is designed for about 72. In practice, obviously, the actual operational flight group of both is somewhat lower, although more so perhaps on Ark Royal than on Yorktown. Yorktown is also a physically slightly larger ship. It's slightly wider, it's slightly longer, and as you'll see in a minute, that's because it's in part because it's somewhat more lightly built. Yorktown also is a little bit quicker and significantly longer range. And thanks to only having a single hangar, Yorktown can obviously get aircraft up to the flight deck faster because they only have to travel one deck. Now flip that round and see what advantages Ark Royal has. Ark Royal is better protected. Both carriers have belt armour over the machinery spaces. Ark Royal's is fractionally thicker. Ark Royal also has a meaningful protected armoured deck. It's not an armoured flight deck, but it is an armoured deck lower in the ship. Yorktown does have deck armour protection, but it's nowhere near as thick as Ark Royal's. Ark Royal also has a significantly better torpedo defense system, and before everyone points out Ark Royal being sunk by a single torpedo, yes, that did happen. However, if you look at where the torpedo struck, it was a over deep running torpedo that actually hit well down on the very bottom of the ship, inside and below the torpedo protection system. So no torpedo protection system on any ship went that deep, and that's not the reason why Ark Royal sank. I mean, the torpedo is, but the effectiveness or not of the torpedo defense system has nothing to do with Ark Royal's loss. So from a passive protection perspective against shells, bombs and torpedoes, Ark Royal is the better protected vessel. Also, Ark Royal is by far the more heavily protected vessel in terms of its anti-aircraft firepower. It has twice as many heavy anti-aircraft guns and a significantly better light and medium anti-aircraft battery than Yorktown does when both ships are commissioned. Now, of course, Ark Royal is sunk before Yorktown even enters World War II. So, of course, Yorktown will get a few additional upgrades for its light and medium anti-aircraft guns before it also is sunk. But in their as-design condition, Ark Royal is by far the better protected ship in terms of active defences as well. And because it has a double hangar, Ark Royal has more enclosed hangar space. So Ark Royal can carry a greater number of aircraft safely inside it, as opposed to having to rely on a deck park. And I suspect that if Ark Royal did use a deck park, then its air group size will probably come up to much closer to Yorktown's. So if you wanted to face the two designs off in battle, essentially, obviously, air group aside, because that's not relevant to the carrier design itself, but if you're assuming generic equal aircraft, Yorktown can loft a larger air group and can travel faster and further, but Ark Royal is more likely to be able to survive an incoming strike and counterattack as compared to Yorktown. Andre de Coult asks, please tell us more about the action of August 1701, Admiral Benbow's last fight against the French, and the trial of the captains and any possible connections or parallels with the Byng trial. How were the sentences regarded at the time and in the modern day, both by themselves and compared to Byng's? So this action predates the Battle of Minorca, which was, of course, Byng's downfall, by about half a century. But it does show a problem which does crop up a certain amount in the first half of the 1700s in the Royal Navy. It doesn't happen all the time, but when it does happen, it's very noticeable. And in fact, a similar situation was experienced by then Captain, later Admiral Hawke, a few decades later, although in that case the perpetrators got away thanks to mostly political connections, whereas in this case, as you'll see, they didn't. So what happened is you had 7 ships of the line, led by the Breda, a 70-gunner. Then there was a 64, a 60, a 54, and 3 48 gunners. So that's the British fleet under John Benbow. And they come across a numerically slightly larger but vastly inferior in firepower French force under Jean de Casse, or Jean de Casse possibly. So he has only 4 ships of the line, a 68, a 60, and 2 50s, plus a frigate and a bunch of unrated vessels. Benbow, rather understandably, decides, right, I'm having that lot, and tries to chase them down and engage them. But basically, apart from Falmouth, which does occasionally come up to try and help, and of course Breda, which Benbow is on, pretty much all the other ships hang back, they don't hoist sails, and in 2 cases they actually even refuse action even when they're parallel with French ships. So they're essentially doing everything up to and including really disobeying orders. They're trying not to engage, despite the fact that the British fleet has an advantage in actual full-on combatants and a significant firepower advantage. Most of the British action is done by the Breda and the Ruby, which is one of the smaller 48s, and as I said, a little bit by the Falmouth, which is another 48. And in the closing stages of the action, Benbow is actually hit in the leg by a French shot, and although he survives that, he will actually later die of infection after the leg is amputated. Now, the funny thing is, Benbow is understandably incensed by his other captain's deliberate lack of action. And believe it or not, the French agree. Jean de Casse, the French admiral, he actually sends a letter to Benbow in the aftermath of the action, and he says, "Sir, I had little hopes on Monday last, but to have supped in your cabin," i.e. basically, I thought I was done for, I was going to be captured, and the next meal I was going to have was as your prisoner in your cabin. But it pleased God to order it otherwise. I am thankful for it. As for those cowardly captains who deserted you, because of course de Casse had a spectator's view of all the goings on, he says, "Hang them, for by God they deserve it." So de Casse is so incensed by the cowardice of these other British captains, he's actually encouraging Benbow to execute them despite the fact that if they'd done their duty, it was very likely that Ducasse would have been captured, because he viewed an honourable capture in honourable battle as a far better fate than, apart from the fact he's thankful to escape, but otherwise he realises he has escaped purely through the cowardice and inaction of a bunch of opponents who, by all rights, had him dead to rights. Then Benbow holds court-martial against basically everybody who didn't actively fight for him. And as a result, Captain Kirkby of the Defiance and Captain Wade of the Greenwich are actually sentenced to be shot. Kirkby in the Defiance is one of the two ships, along with the Windsor under Captain Constable, which repeatedly refused Benbow's orders. They were the closest to the Breda, and they refused to support it, and they also broke off action. Wade, aboard the Greenwich never caught up. Wade was sentenced to be shot partly because he was testified that he was basically drunk the entire time. Constable just about avoids the same fate as Kirkby and Wade, but he gets dismissed from the service anyway. There's a bunch of other charges against some of the other captains, but the Defiance, the Windsor, and the Greenwich are the three main culprits. Incidentally, they're also the three most powerful ships in the British fleet after the Breda. Now, Benbow then sends all the captains he's convicted at court-martial back home, and the Admiralty, actually, in the worst cases, Kirkby, Wade, and Constable, they say, yep, no, that's entirely justified. Kirkby and Wade are shot. Constable's dismissed from the service. The other captains are allowed to return to the service because their charges were much, much less. And in both the time period and I think in the majority of historians today, it's night and day between this and Byng. Byng, pretty much everyone at the time and now agrees he shouldn't have been shot. He was a victim of circumstance more than a victim of cowardice. He definitely wasn't a coward. He was given a very, very poor hand to play. Whereas, these captains absolutely were derelict of their duty and deserved everything they had coming to them. And as I would also put forward a strong argument for several of the captains at the other battle off Toulon, which I mentioned, the then captain, later Admiral Hawke witnessed, they should also have been shot for cowardice, but they escaped thanks to political connections. So yes, the problem was this kind of issue did, as I said, recur a few times in the first half of the 18th century in the Royal Navy. So while being executed was, it was completely unfair to Byng, on the other hand, if you want to look for a silver lining, the fact that the Royal Navy was willing to execute such a high-ranking officer for cowardice basically, for the most part, put an end to this kind of action, because in the future everyone knew that you weren't going to save yourself by declining action, you'd just get shot as a coward, which arguably was far worse than getting shot as a hero, because at least then your legacy wouldn't be tarnished. Volunteer per Order O'Sullivan asks, signal flares, why were they not used by battle fleet commanders in the First World War? It's not like your code is going to be broken in the course of a single battle, and flares would be much easier to discern than signal flags. Two main reasons. Firstly is that signal flares are unfortunately quite temporary. So when you're giving orders, you hoist the flags, but one of the standard methods when it comes to flag signals is you hoist the flag and you wait for your subordinates to acknowledge receipt of the signal, and then you order the execution of the signal. So it can take a few minutes before everybody realizes what's going on. If you launch flares, yes, in theory, the launching of big bright flares will be somewhat more noticeable than hoisting flags. But the problem is that if you've got guns firing, smoke from the guns, and potentially funnel smoke and everything like that, you might miss the flares. And if you do, well, the flares are there and then they're gone, relatively speaking, quickly. So you could miss the signal entirely, and then you don't really have a way of asking for a repeat of a signal that you don't even know has occurred. Whereas if you hoist flags, at least in theory, even if there is some temporary interference in the form of smoke or gun flashes, etc., the flags can still be there afterwards for everybody to see. And related to that is also the signal flares of necessity are going to be far less complex than flags. So you can order quite a lot of different things to happen with flags, whereas with flares, you know, and unless you want your bridge parties to start getting into an argument as to whether that flare was indigo or violet or blue, you can only really use a few colours, and you don't want to make it too long because, well, what happens if you're launching flares and one of them malfunctions and you accidentally send off the wrong signal, or people, again, miss one or two flares, or whatever. You can only order some very basic stuff with flares, and with flag signals, you just have a much greater radius of options to choose from. And then the other big problem is that, yes, your code may not be broken in the course of a single battle, but as I said, you're going to have to keep it fairly simple, and relatively simple launching of flares, even if the enemy doesn't strictly know what that means. They know, if they know that it means something, then they could start launching flares of their own to try and confuse all the people in your navy. So if they see on the horizon, oh yeah, look, enemy fleet's approaching, and they've fired a red flare and then two white flares, and then they've all turned towards us. Well, maybe that means chase the enemy, maybe it means turn to port, I don't know. But then if we're trying to get away from them, you might as well fire a red flare and two white flares, because if it does mean turn to port, they might all think, oh, we're turning to port for some reason, maybe there's torpedoes incoming, and that'll cause them to break off action. Or if somebody, as happened actually with searchlight signals during Jutland, if an enemy ship goes unobserved and they see, let's say, a green and a blue flare being fired, and then another ship on the same side fires a yellow flare in response, then it's fairly logical to go, okay, that first set is a recognition challenge, that's the correct response. So then if they find themselves approaching a British ship and they think, oh, the British ship is beginning to be suspicious of us, well, we'll fire the same British recognition flare pattern, and then they'll think we're friendly. Or if we're challenged, we now know what the proper response is. And obviously that's looking at it from a German perspective, looking at the British perspective, but the British can be doing exactly the same thing to the Germans. So it opens up far too much of an option for confusion and enemy counteraction, even if they don't necessarily strictly know exactly what each flare signal system means. Plus, of course, each flare is a one-off use item, so although you can carry a lot of them, the thing is with flags is unless they get shot away, you can just keep reusing flags ad infinitum. You will eventually run out of flares trying to order a battle fleet around it for any particular length of time. Prusi Antica asks, Clipper crews seem incredibly small for the amount of sail they have compared to the last sailing ships before the ironclad era. What technologies enabled this, and would it be possible to apply them to sailing warships? What might be the smallest size crew that you could realistically and safely sail something like Britannia or HMS Victoria of the 1850s with, if you could fit them with whatever made the minimal crews of the Clippers feasible? The problem is that there are two things that make Clipper crews so much smaller, and unfortunately neither of them is really viable on a big warship. The first is the fact that the T-Clipper is so ridiculously fast that, unlike a lot of long-distance merchantmen from times gone by, plus of course the greater security that you have in the 19th century, T-Clippers generally weren't armed, or might carry a signal gun or two, but unlike an East Indiaman, they don't have much, if any, armament at all, and that means you don't need crew to man them. And if you don't need crew to man them, well, hey, you've just reduced your crew numbers. Happy days. Also, you're carrying a fairly inert cargo, so you don't really need many men on hand to handle cargo that might be shifting or, heaven forbid, alive. So, yeah, not having armament on a first-rate ship of the line, that's unfortunately not really an option. The gun crews of big first-rate ships of the line are by far the majority of their crew. The other issue, which you might guess, looking at this is the Taiping, one of the Clippers, is that they although they use 3 masts, they use many, many smaller sails. Now, why is that important? Well, it's because hoisting and lowering sails is a very manpower intensive task. These things are quite heavy. So if you have multiple smaller sails, you might then get lots and lots of surface area as a total. But if each sail is smaller and therefore lighter and easier to handle, you don't need as many men. And because with T-clippers, while you do obviously have to adjust sail from time to time, generally speaking, you set your sail and run with the wind, and any changes you need to make, except in emergencies, are going to be relatively minor. You therefore don't need anywhere near as many actual sailors. You know, emphasis on the sail part. You don't need as many men aloft. The flip side to that is that having multiple smaller sails is less efficient, both in terms of catchment area for the wind and in terms of overall weight up top, as compared to fewer larger sails, which need more men to handle them, which is what you find on warships. So you could reduce the number of men aloft that you needed on a first rate by giving it this kind of multi-smaller sail layout, but you would make its overall weight up top somewhat greater, therefore making the ship slightly less stable, and your net saving in crew isn't going to be all that much because, as I said, the vast majority of your crew are down on the hull itself to fight the guns. Pedden Harley asks, Drac, if we patrons passed the hat and collected £1 million for you to conduct experiments and film a Naval Mythbusters video or videos of your choice, what naval myth or myths would you seek to bust on that type of budget? I definitely seek to scale up my Greek fire new mixtures, the new and improved mixtures I've worked on since the last video I did on Greek fire. And then instead of doing them in kind of shot glass amounts, I'd be able to do them in sort of full scale amounts, perhaps with a full-on siphon as well, to demonstrate their true volatility and ridiculous destructive capabilities. I think I'd also get a few large-scale model ships commissioned to demonstrate things like progressive flooding, free surface effect, citadels, and how they keep water out and keep buoyancy up, that kind of stuff. I'd probably also redo the experiments that I did showing the difference between brittle and ductile armour and why you have face-hardened armour, because obviously I did that with cardboard and glass, because that's what I have access to in the UK and is relatively inexpensive. But if I've got the budget for it, then I could go and get some actual proper, you know, soft, maybe mild steel or something, some proper very hardened steel, and get some proper face-hardened armour made, and then get it shot with actual firearms or even small-scale artillery, so you can see the full-scale effects, or near as, makes no difference, full-scale effects up close and in really high res. Probably get a slow-mo camera as well to film it all. Oh, and something else that I've been thinking of doing that I'd really like to do, but I'd have to find someone with the appropriate certification to do, which would be to make up £1 quantities of different types of explosives. So gunpowder, gun cotton, RDX, Torpex, TNT, hexanite, etc., etc. And then using a slow-mo camera and either a lake or a very large tank, set them off one by one. So for the shells, the shell filler and the propellant, obviously you set them up in enclosed environments, but in air. And for the torpedo explosives, set them up next to a disposable ship hull, scale model ship hull. And by filming them in slow motion, you'd then be able to see how fast each explosive acts and how it acts. You know, is there a really short, sharp explosion with a powerful shockwave? Is it a more of a gradual explosion with a more gradual but perhaps more impulsive shockwave? That kind of stuff. Michael Imbezi asks, the Navy recently announced that Colonel Harvey C. Barnum, U.S. Marine Corps retired, rowed the sea trials for the Arleigh Burke-class destroyer USS Harvey C. Barnum, and that this was the first time this had happened since Arleigh Burke rowed on the USS Arleigh Burke. Are there any examples in the period the channel covers of people getting to ride warships that were named after them? There are a few people. I mean, there's some cases where the lifespan of the person and the ship overlap, so it's theoretically possible. So in this case, as you can see in the picture, this is the 120-gun first-rate HMS St. Vincent, and that was around for almost a decade during the last part of the lifespan of John Jervis, who was the Earl of St. Vincent, for whom the ship was named. So I don't know definitively if Earl St. Vincent visited HMS St. Vincent, but it is theoretically possible. One thing that I can confirm is that King George VI visited HMS Duke of York in 1945. In fact, he visited Duke of York several times and came aboard the ship. And of course, the Duke of York is what King George VI's title was before the death of his father, King George V, because the Prince of Wales turned out to be Edward VIII, who then swanned off to be a Nazi collaborator, which meant the Duke of York went straight from being Duke of York, skipped Prince of Wales straight to being king, but he had at one point been the Duke of York, so technically by being aboard HMS Duke of York, he was aboard a ship that was actually named for him, and actually genuinely was named for him. That's why the King George V were King George V, Prince of Wales, Duke of York, and then they went on to admirals' names. But that's a whole other little kerfuffle. I mean, generally speaking, if you think of most British monarchs, they probably, well, before King George VI, they probably have been on ships named after them at some point, because there was a standing tradition to name the first capital ship built in the reign of a new monarch after said monarch. So there was obviously King George V. What was the second King George V would have been King Edward VIII, had Edward VIII not skedaddled. There was the first King George V, there was a King Edward VII, there were several Victorias, etc., etc., etc. So, yeah, I mean, I know it's a little bit of a cheat code, but there you go. Uniform 26 asks, this may be more of an engineering question than a historical one, but it was mentioned somewhere that we no longer have the capacity to manufacture mid-20th century battleship armour. However, I was watching a rerun of a History Channel episode of Modern Marvels where they briefly discussed the technology of explosive welding, where two plates of dissimilar metals are laid atop one another and then welded together by setting off a covering of explosive. It got me thinking, if someone wanted to build a modern battleship and no one wanted to go through all the expense of relearning how to do face-hardened plates 14 inches or more thick, and building all the associated industrial capacity, could one use explosive welding to take a plate of mild steel and weld it onto a plate of case-hardened steel, essentially getting battleship armour on the cheap? In principle, it might be possible, but I have a feeling there may be two major obstacles. Firstly, you'd have the fact that, as you can see with this diagram, the thinner plate, which is attached to the thicker plate, has to flex because it's spaced and then it's essentially just violently shoved onto the backer plate via the explosion. Now, of course, the thinner element of battleship armour is the face-hardened plate, which is very, very brittle comparatively. So I would have concerns that you might end up just breaking it. But the flip side, of course, is that you could flip those around and have the thicker but more flexible back plate, as you said, explosively welded to the front plate. My concern then would be, given the thickness of that softer backing plate, the amount of explosive you would need to actually move and flex that in such a way as to create an explosive weld. Could you actually do that without that amount of explosive just blowing the plate apart? I don't know, because I don't know enough about explosive welding. My other concern, which I think would be a much larger issue, is the fact that the transition from the hard face to the soft face of battleship armour is a gradual one, done obviously by forced cooling of one side and slow cooling of the other. And the thing is, that graduation is actually quite vital for the whole plate supporting itself and keeping together. With explosive welding, although you do get the weld is at a very definitive and relatively sharp transition, and I have a feeling that may not work quite as well. So, yes, you probably could recreate face-hardened plate using explosive welding, but I don't think it would be as efficient or as good quality, if you like, in terms of overall resistance as traditionally done battleship armor plate. And I do have some question over whether you'd be able to do it at the thicknesses required. But with that latter bit, as I said, I don't know enough about explosive welding to say yes or no on 100% on that latter section. John Plate asks, how many potential pipe bombs are on your average warship through the ages? Well, if we start with cannon-armed wooden warships, every single cannon is a potential pipe bomb, as is every single firearm early on. The magazines, of course, are large pipe bombs. As you move on with more modern guns and propellants, obviously each of the gun barrels still, especially when they're muzzle-loading, less so when they're breech-loading, but very definitely muzzle-loaders, because it's much easier to accidentally double-load them. The magazines, interestingly, as well as being generally pipe bombs, also have lesser pipe bombs in them once you start having charges contained in their own hard cases, either for storage or as part of the firing sequence if you're using Krupp-type guns. And as you move into the age of steam, then obviously the boilers and the engine cylinders or the turbine rotor sections, etc., as well as obviously each of the boiler chambers, the steam pipes, any hydraulic system, some of the oil feed lines if they're under particularly high pressure once you get to oil-fired ships, mines, torpedoes, depth charges, compressed air canisters, aviation gasoline holders, whatever system you're using to launch aircraft if you have catapults. There's a lot of things that could potentially go boom in various nasty ways. Yokosuka Girls Marine High School training vessel Harakaze asks, I know the crews of some vessels killed their officers or detained them and then either set them and loyalists adrift or otherwise sailed into a port, such as a few times during the Napoleonic Wars, but are there any known instances of officers, crew, ship and all just going, nope, and going over to the enemy and saying, hi, we'd all like to defect and join you, please? It is very rare, but it has happened. Most notably, when it happens most commonly in civil wars. And actually, there's some pretty good examples in the English Civil War, or civil wars, the Roundhead Royalist kerfuffle. Anyway, at the beginning of the Civil War, a good chunk of the Royal Navy, which is of course ostensibly under the King's control, just turned around and went, nah, we're on Parliament side now. Like the whole lot. Ships, officers, crews, a very small royalist fleet was left over. And then later on, the flip side was that in 1648, a whole bunch of Navy ships basically had gotten fed up of Parliament at that point and just turned around and they had a new commander assigned to them. And then while that commander was ashore at Deal, they just said, no, we're not working for Parliament anymore, go away. Take a merchant ship back to London and to tell them that we are now for the king. And they sent letters, and it was, again, literally officers, men, everybody, pretty much the whole fleet just went, nope, we don't believe that Parliament is sovereign anymore. We're back in favour of the king. And there were smaller scale versions of this back and forth throughout the English civil wars. And as I said, in civil wars, this is where you tend to see wholesale defection of pretty much everybody on board. Outside of that, it does tend to be either the officers or the men, but rarely both. Peter Guy asks, when I visited museum ships such as USS Massachusetts, I've noticed that the stairs between decks are incredibly steep. This isn't that bad going up the stairs, but going down them is an adventure for a middle-aged civilian like myself, although maybe not so much for an 18-year-old sailor. Do you know why they're so steep? It's a mixture of efficiency and protection, because if they are shallower, so more like a set of stairs than a very slightly inclined ladder, then they're going to occupy a lot more volume inside the ship. And if you think about how many up and down accesses there need to be inside a ship, that's going to actually add up to quite a lot of internal volume, and that's volume that could be used for other things. And it could also be volume that's not necessarily available, because in some areas of the ship where you're going up and down, you actually find, if you like, the landings on each deck are very small and cramped. And if you angled stairway out a bit more, you physically wouldn't be able to get the stairway in, or you'd have, as you can see with, in this case, this is actually on board USS Massachusetts, you can see that beam just above where the red arrow is. If this was angled further along, then people would be hitting their head on that beam. So it's got to conform to the internal space requirements of ships. Another matter is that you may very well be passing fairly large objects through the ship, through these access ways. And if the stairways are fairly steep, then you can near enough pass these things up and down, and perhaps even use the stairways themselves as a little bit of a sort of a guide and support. If you make them very angled, that actually compromises your ability to near vertically lift relatively heavy loads. And another factor in terms of protection is that obviously if it's very steep, then as the human body ascends and descends, you don't move all that much in the horizontal direction as you move vertically, and that means that the hatchways can be relatively small. If the stairways were considerably shallower, then that would mean you'd need very long rectangular hatches, because you'd be moving quite a lot horizontally as you came up past the deck level, or went down past the deck level. And that would be a twofold problem. One, especially when you get to armoured decks, because you'd be creating large holes in the armoured deck, which wouldn't be necessary, and just large holes generally, which could be a problem when it comes to sealing up the ship and so forth. And secondly, if you've ever had to lift any of those hatches, even the ones that aren't through the armoured deck are pretty darn heavy. If you double, triple, or quadruple the size of those things, you may end up with hatches that can't actually be physically opened by one man, which could be a problem. And also, at least in the case of the ones that go through regular decks, if something happens and causes them to fall shut, then at least with those, their weight is such that a person can resist them closing. You're not going to resist armoured deck hatch shutting, but, you know, silver linings and clouds and all of that. Whereas if you had, you know, maybe a 5 foot by 5 foot hatch or something like that, or something bigger to account for stairs that were fairly shallow, then even the hatches that go through regular decks, not the armoured ones, would cut a man in half or crush them if they happen to end up closing for some reason while someone was in them. Explicitly Implicit asks, I actually find the boring process of gun manufacturing quite interesting, so I wanted to ask, do you have any pictures of the tools and drills that were used to perform said processes, or video recordings of bore drilling to explain the different steps and processes in a bit more detail? Yes, in fact, in April last year, I did an entire video on the manufacture of battleship guns, and that included everything obviously from forging the initial billets all the way through to boring out the barrels. You can see a drill boring out the barrel here. So yeah, if you want a much fuller explanation than I'll be able to do in 5 minutes, I would suggest go and have a look at that video. And some of the pictures there are taken as stills from a couple of period videos on the manufacture of naval guns. So if you would like to see the full videos in question, the archive videos, I can send you links to those as well. JJ Smith asks, on the morning of D-Day, the British had 5, technically 7, battleships available for the bombardment force, including Nelson and Rodney. Why were Warspite and Ramillies chosen? Were they the best balance of capable versus expendable? No, it was essentially that they didn't think there would be that many targets that merited a battleship's attention on the actual day of the landings. You had US battleships covering some portion of the beaches, and you had plenty of other ships, cruisers and destroyers available for fire support as well. And there's also the fact that they knew that once the battle really got going, there would be a lot of call for heavy battleship gunfire support, both in terms of them just bringing the absolute heaviest firepower available, plus if there were some recalcitrant shore batteries, they'd be the best equipped to fight them because they had the armour to protect themselves against incoming shots. And of course the battleship's guns also have the longest ranges, so they'd be able to support the advance further in than the cruisers and destroyers could. all of that meant that if you committed all your bombardment battleships to the opening engagement in Normandy, and they blew through their shell loads in the first few days, you could find yourself in a situation where pretty much all or almost all of your battleships are having to leave the area to go back to restock, and leaving you with very little to no heavy gunfire support. Whereas if you put a couple of battleships in this case a Warspite and Ramillies, then that gives you the cover that you require. You have Nelson and Rodney in reserve, immediate reserve, if there turns out to be some extra special targets that need attention, and you have other ships in a more distant reserve. And basically what that means is that Warspite and Ramillies can start the firing, lots of 15-inch shells and all that, and then as they start to run out of ammunition or potentially get damaged by air attack or underwater attack or shoreboat batteries or whatever, at some point they are going to need to fall back. And when they do that, you can bring in your next two battleships and bring up the reserves. And then if anything happens to those battleships before they run out of ammunition, then you can put the reserves in. And even if they run out of ammunition, then you bring those reserves in. And hopefully by the time your second set of reserves have come in, your first set of battleships have reloaded and come back to open fire again. So it's about maintaining continuous bombardment presence throughout the Overlord campaign into Normandy, rather than essentially alpha striking, but then having no battleship fire support on the 9th or 10th of June, for example. Sildaron Machine Works asks, breech-loading naval guns are generally rated to fire a certain number of shots before they're taken out of service. But what about muzzle-loading guns? I can't imagine somebody on a 3-decker keeping track of each shot fired from each gun, so how was lifespan determined? Were they given a qualitative inspection, or were measurements taken? And could a bronze or iron cannon be rebored or refinished in some way, or were they just melted down and recast? Generally speaking, the vagaries and uncertainties involved in casting and producing either bronze or iron cannon in the Age of Sail were such that you couldn't really say, I have manufactured this 32-pounder long gun, and this and all the others like it are going to have a 500-round barrel life. There's no way you could humanly guarantee that. You might have, let's say, done 10 guns, and one of them might explode 150 shots in, and two of them might last for 700 shots, and everybody else is somewhere in between. It's very, very difficult to predict at that point. So they didn't sort of say, oh yeah, well, we expect it to last exactly this much. What they tend to do is, as a sort of, there would be rough rules of thumb of, well, this is a new gun of such and such a shot caliber from such and such a manufacturer. Obviously that would all be stamped on, and people would have a broad idea of how long they'd expect that gun to last. And if they were assigned to that gun for long enough, then after a certain point they'd start to check the gun for, are there visible cracks forming? Does it sound different when it's being fired? And this kind of thing. Because as a muzzle-loading gun begins to fail, if you know what you're listening to, you will actually hear a slight difference in the report when it fires as it starts to fail, assuming it doesn't just catastrophically immediately fail for some reason. Now, the other thing, of course, is that unlike 20th century battleship cannon, which are basically on the ship until they're worn out and then they're taken away and dealt with, for Age of Sail ships, they'd have a bunch of cannon on board and they'd sail around for a few weeks, a few months, possibly years. But the overall lifespan of a cast iron or gun or a bronze gun, bearing in mind, obviously, they're not firing with anything like as much energy. They're not firing with anything like as tight a fit, etc., as compared to a high velocity 45 caliber 15-inch gun or something like that. So their barrel lives are going to be very, very long anyway in comparison. They're also massively overbuilt, comparatively speaking. So it's very unlikely that if you have vaguely decent guns, you're actually going to shoot them out during a single ship's commission. And when the ship comes back and pays off, the guns are taken off and examined at an ordnance storage facility. and they'll be rated there. You know, that someone will look over them and go, okay, these ones are in pretty good condition. These ones are in okay condition. These ones I'm not so sure about. Maybe we stick those on the ship that we know is only going out for a few weeks. These ones are pretty much past it, so we're going to stick them on the discard pile. And then when the ship recommissions, they will try and supply it with guns that they reckon are still in pretty good condition, so the crew shouldn't usually have to worry about guns wearing out. So those kind of inspections are generally done on land. Now, in terms of could you rebore or refinish a gun or melt it down and recast it, with bronze guns, that's much easier. With bronze guns, if a bronze gun fails, yeah, you can just take it back and melt it down, and you're going to get most of that material back in a newly cast gun. With iron guns, it's not worth melting the things down to recast them, which is why you get, you know, in London, for example, a lot of bollards. The older ones, at least, are literally just cannon wedged into the ground. Old guns, sometimes captured ones as well, but often very just worn out guns. So worn out naval cannon, sometimes they'd sell them on into merchant use, because a merchantman might sail for years and years and years with the same set of cannon and only expect to use them a half a dozen times, at which point a gun that might only have 50 or 100 shots in it is fine, because they're very, very unlikely to ever reach that level. And of course, a lot of merchant ships will be on the lookout for a cheap gun. You could also potentially cut the gun down and use it as a carronade, although that was relatively rare because carronades were quite cheap and cheerful to manufacture anyway. There are occasional records of liners being put into bigger guns to make them into smaller ones, but that's a very rare thing, and it tends to happen for some reason in the early 19th century. But generally speaking, one of the attractions of iron cannon as compared to bronze ones is they're pretty cheap and easy to make. So if you've got a worn-out gun, you might as well just get scrap value for it and get a new one from a manufacturer. That's going to be by far the easiest and cheapest method, and probably the quickest one as well. The Fighting Irish-American Destroyer asks, there's something of a naval legend going around where the US Navy had to keep the crews of South Dakota and Washington separate when on shore leave due to them getting into a bar fight with each other that soon became indistinguishable from a riot. Did this actually happen, and if so, when and where did it happen? Yes, it actually did happen, and it happened multiple times in multiple locations where the security slipped. Obviously, the first time they didn't realize it was going to happen, but afterwards they really did. What it all stems from is actually from the Guadalcanal campaign, the famous engagement, particularly with Admiral Lee leading Washington and South Dakota, and they're obviously sinking Hiroshima. And what obviously happened in that battle, South Dakota got shot up a bit, had to go back for repairs. Washington stayed in the area. However, due to the reporting restrictions that were in place at the time, while the US newspapers could eventually report that there had been a victory and the Hiroshima had been sunk, they weren't allowed to reveal the identity of the latest US battleships. Now, Washington and North Carolina were a little bit different because obviously they were already known about from a pre-war perspective, but saying exactly where they were was still, you know, not allowed. And so South Dakota was being referred to at the time as Battleship X, because then it sort of anonymizes it. You can mention that there is a battleship without saying what it is, what its specifications are, etc., etc. Unfortunately, the media then decided that since they didn't have a cover name for Washington, and therefore couldn't say where she was at all, but they did have a cover name for Battleship X, they could mention that Battleship X had been present during the sinking of the Hiroshima, and so from a media perspective, whatever Battleship X was became associated with being the thing that sank Hiroshima. Of course, the men on South Dakota knew that Battleship X was them, and then when they came back for repairs in the States, they kind of rode the expectation that, oh yes, of course, we were the ones that sank Hiroshima, claiming credit where they really didn't have any. And then by the time Washington came back for some R&R, and South Dakota's crew were in the same area, of course, South Dakota's crew would go on about how they were the ones that had dealt with the Kirishima, and Washington's crew took exception to that, and a massive brawl broke out, and after that, yeah, this is like battleship scale kill stealing going on. There was a huge amount of tension between the crews for a very long time afterwards, and they had to basically be kept separate on any kind of shore leave. Michael Gilson asks, I've been hypothetically considering the idea of a navy building London Treaty sloops with the intention of rapidly converting them to fleet destroyers. My concept is building them with high-pressure boilers but vertical triple expansion engines, with the engine rooms going all the way up to the top deck. When you make the conversion, you pull the vertical triple expansions out and pop in geared turbines, and the excess space above the turbines allows you to add decks with torpedo launchers and torpedo support equipment. But is it possible to get a hull form that will permit the needed speed on conversion that doesn't scream, this is all a cheat on the treaty, and have that built before the conversion? If this is possible, beside the usual suspects such as Japan and Italy, I could see this appealing to the US Navy and the Royal Navy. The US Navy because treaty sloops are allowed a higher displacement, and the Royal Navy is a way to fool the Treasury. I think you could do such a thing, but with a couple of big caveats. Firstly, you're going to need to pre-stock these geared turbine sets because geared turbines are a major industrial throttle, especially in wartime production. Even the US had this problem. So I think looking at the text of the London Naval Treaty, the way you would get around this would be multiple different preparatory factors. So you could pre-stock geared turbine sets by essentially, I mean, you're going to turn these things into fleet destroyers anyway, so just order a bunch of spare geared turbine sets in peacetime for your existing fleet destroyers, so you're using the same set, and then you can justify this as essentially saying, well, look, we're planning on running our fleet destroyers quite hard, and therefore we might have machinery that needs to be refitted or machinery that might break, so we're just going to have a warehouse full of turbines ready to go, so if a destroyer has engine trouble or anything, or we need to refit it, we don't have to have the lag of waiting to build a new set of machinery. So that would explain why you have a bunch of geared turbines waiting in a warehouse. Probably come up with a plan of what to do with the vertical triple expansion engines as well. Maybe have a preset plan for corvettes or merchant ships or something like that. And then, because you can't have more than 4 guns above 3-inch caliber, what I would do is design the hull in such a way that it is basically almost a fleet destroyer's hull in most respects, but have it mount 3 guns in the caliber you want, i.e. the caliber you're going to have for your fleet destroyer. So that might be a 4.7-inch if you're doing it for the British, a 5-inch if you're doing it for the Americans, and you mount 3 single guns in near enough the layout that the Royal Navy did its sloops, as you can see here. So a pair superfiring forward and 1 aft. But because you're making the hull relatively large, you make sure you strengthen the deck mountings to take a twin mount of those guns. Because as the British found upgrading single fours to twin fours and so forth, as long as you have a relatively coherent design principle, it's actually not a huge weight increase to double up the guns. So if you're building the ship with excess displacement in already, and you're designing it with 3 guns of a given caliber, then you can double those up. Now you have 6 guns. That's a meaningful fleet destroyer armament in a decent layout. And for the area above where your engines are, this, I think, is where the subtlety comes in, because if a ship is designed for no greater than 20 knots, which is what a sloop is supposed to be, then it's going to have a shorter length to beam ratio. So why would you have a longer, more fleet destroyer style length to beam ratio? Well, I think what you would do is you would sell these as long-distance patrol sloops designed for search and rescue, anti-piracy and scouting, as well as anti-submarine warfare. So essentially a kind of halfway house between an anti-submarine ship and a colonial gunboat. And because of that, clearly, you need aircraft. So you would put an aircraft launching turntable and recovery crane between your aftmost funnel and your mainmast further back. Now, of course, as you can see with this kind of sloop, there's not a huge amount of space when you're talking about aircraft operations, so clearly your hull needs to be longer, and it's purely just to accommodate this aircraft, because you're not allowed to have more than 3 aircraft aboard, and you're not allowed to receive aircraft from the air, so they are going to have to be seaplanes. So if you really want to push the boat out on length, you could even say, well, we can't have more than 3 aircraft, but we can maybe have 2. So 2 aircraft, a catapult, a collapsible hangar, and some cranes. Well, it's not going to be the most practical of sloops, but it might have, a degree of utility in pirate hunting and colonial missions in peacetime. And that would give you the length. It gives you the armament upgrade capability. You've already got the depth charges in the stern, because that's allowed for sloops. And then when push comes to shove, as long as you've got a series of small dry docks that can take ships of this size, and you have, the plans pre-done, then it's not going to be quick, but with a relative degree of ease, you should be able to pull the engines and refit them. It's probably a program that you'd want to start doing en masse in the immediate run-up to war rather than in wartime itself. Brimark 359 asks, could you please tell us about the history of mortars and howitzers used in coast defence installations? Was this only a US thing? How effective were they in practice? And I assume their effectiveness would be primarily dependent on how well they could be pre-plotted. The idea of using a mortar as a coastal defence weapon does go back a fair way. Even in the Age of Sail, you do have some mortars being used in coastal defence positions. But the idea kind of waxes and wanes and comes and goes throughout the Age of Sail and then into the early part of the ironclad era and then the steam era, and steel era for that matter, simply because the advantage of a mortar is, of course, you use it as an indirect fire weapon, so you don't need to expose your battery, so you're less vulnerable to return fire, and you may not be seen in the first place. Now, back in the Age of Sail, and almost all the way through the 19th century, of course, engagement ranges are pretty short, because everything's being aimed by the human eye, so the fact that a mortar is going to have less absolute range than a direct fire gun doesn't make too much odds, because they can both easily cover the ranges that are needed to defend the locations they're at, and more than cover the ranges at which ships can counter fire. And also, in the earlier days, a lot of coastal fortifications tended to guard things like very narrow approaches to harbours and so forth, so the distance from where your fortress was to, say, the other headland at the entrance of a harbour, or the radius to defend a dockyard, was well within the capabilities of a mortar. But there were also a lot of disadvantages to using mortars. For one, because the mortar goes in a very high ballistic arc, it takes quite a while compared to a direct fire weapon to actually impact the ship. So you have to, even in the Age of Sail, lead your target somewhat, unless the target is stationary. And because the round is coming down at a much steeper angle, the area in which it's going to hit and will hit a ship is much, much smaller. It's called a variety of things. Some people call it the beaten zone or whatever, but basically, if the mortar round is coming down at 70, 80 degrees or something like that, you pretty much have to actually be perfectly spot on with your aim, which, given that you have a much longer arc and therefore a longer travel time and you're aiming entirely by eye, you probably don't. And, a mortar that has missed by 20 feet in terms of the distance between you and the ship is just going to drop into the water. Whereas with a direct fire weapon, okay, if you're short, you're still short. You might skip the cannonball, which might help. But if your aim is slightly long, there's actually a fair number of ship widths that you could be long by, whereby as long as you're in line, the round might still hit. So essentially, mortars could be fairly devastating if they managed to drop a heavy round in on a ship's deck, but the chances of them actually scoring such a hit were relatively small. But then fast forward to the end of the 19th century, and ships are getting absurd levels of belt armour. Their height profile is decreasing quite rapidly because of these absurd thicknesses of iron and compound armour. And that's actually making, A, the chances of scoring a hit with a direct fire weapon less likely, and B, even if you do hit, there is a diminishing chance you're actually going to get through the belt armour. But deck armour is still very thin. And since ranges are still fairly short, suddenly you see this massive upswing in the idea of using mortars, because now you can fire a big shell, drop it in on the deck, and do devastating damage in an area that ships aren't really protected. And while ships have gotten a little bit faster, if we're talking the 1880s, and the early 1890s, which is kind of when the mortars really take off, then they really aren't that much faster. The US does go into mortars in a big way, but you find defensive mortar installations from the late 19th, early 20th century in Britain, Russia, Germany, pretty much anywhere that's building serious coastal fortifications. But the effectiveness of mortars is, for the most part, a very, very short-lived thing. They still have some degree of utility in defending narrow passages, and they still have the advantages of not being seen and all of that stuff that we discussed earlier. But they very quickly run into a problem, which is that as time goes on, quite quickly, even by the end of the 1890s and certainly by the 1900s, ships start getting faster and faster. Then you have turbines and they get faster still. And with the advent of fire control systems and rangefinders, gunnery from ships gets considerably longer in terms of range. And now the range of direct fire emplacements actually matters relative to the somewhat shorter distance of mortars, and you start to get situations where ships could, in theory, engage your defensive fortifications out of the range or at the very limits of the range of your mortars, and since the ships are capable of moving relatively easily at reasonably high speeds, your chances of hitting them are slim to none. And even if you install fire control equipment and rangefinders in your fortifications, you still have the fact that the mortars have a much, much longer flight time than a direct fire weapon, so you need separate firing tables for them, and there's not an inconsiderable chance that a ship, if it sees the puff of your mortars firing, could maneuver, and then, assuming that you were on target, you won't be now because the ship is just gone out of the way of your shot. And so the real effectiveness of mortars in anything other than the extremely confined waters of very specific situations really came and went quite quickly. And there, to be fair, there were attempts to try and overcome this issue, sort of linked batteries of mortars to saturate an area to make up for individual inaccuracy and so forth. But very quickly people realised that for the cost, weight and expense of having half a dozen mortars that might hit something by scattershotting a whole area, you could just install one or two big 12, 13, 14-inch guns and just engage targets directly and at considerably greater ranges. Eric Van Dooting asks, there are many accounts of Japanese surface ships launching their Type 93 torpedoes from much greater ranges than other navies could do, but rarely do you see such accounts from Japanese submarines launching their Type 95s. Is this because sighting and ranging from a sub is so much more difficult and sub-captains wouldn't want to waste their finite numbers of torpedoes on low-probability long-range shots? Yeah, that's pretty much spot on. Submarines getting fire control solutions as opposed to ships who can have their torpedo computers, or at least the sighting systems for said torpedo computers, mounted significantly higher above the waves. They need to get far, far closer to their targets just to identify their targets in the first place, and then cut loose with torpedoes. And while a submarine, especially a large Japanese submarine, might carry more torpedoes than a destroyer, the fact is that submarine is almost certainly going to be alone. Destroyers tend to have friends with them. Same thing with cruisers. And of course, destroyers and cruisers have other options for engaging the enemy, like guns. Whereas for a submarine, unless it wants to get really adventurous with its deck gun, those torpedoes are all they've got. So yeah, to get a firm identification on a target and have a reasonable chance of hitting the target with your relatively precious torpedoes, you do have to get a lot closer. Plus, of course, the Type 95 is a 21-inch diminutive of a Type 93, and as such it also has a shorter range anyway. I think the maximum range of the longest range version of the Type 95 is about half the shortest range of the Type 93. And as time goes on, I think in part because they're acknowledging that, yes, you might have a theoretical range at a low speed setting of 10,000 yards, but no submarine is ever going to shoot a torpedo at 10,000 yards. Further updates to the Type 95 and Japanese submarine launched torpedoes generally consistently trade off range for greater warhead capacity. So later models of the Type 95, for example, can only go about 5,000 to 6,000 yards, but they do that very quickly with a very, very large warhead. And obviously, the other thing you've got to remember is that even with a torpedo that can go 45 to 50 knots, if you're, let's say, 1,500 yards away from a target, you're not firing your torpedo over a distance of 1,500 yards. If your target is a warship, and the Japanese liked hunting warships over merchant ships, let's say it's traveling at about 20 knots. Well, if you're firing at 1,500 yards, your torpedo can close that distance in about a minute, but in that minute at 20 knots, the ship is going to have moved almost another 700 yards further forward. So that means even if you are perfectly perpendicular to your target and your target is traveling straight across your face at 90 degrees, your torpedo needs to travel 1,600 to 1,700 yards to actually make the interception when you're doing a deflection shot. And that's in an ideal circumstance. You may be 1,500 yards away from your target, but if your target is already sailing away from you, let's say it's 30 degrees away from perpendicular ahead of you and is maybe also sailing away from you, then the torpedo is going to have to go, even though the shot is taken at a physical distance of 1,500 yards between your ships, that torpedo might have to travel 3,000 or 4,000 yards before it actually catches the ship. And so, yeah, this is why submarines tend to take their shots at a very close range, as opposed to using a long lance. They tend to be used where two units of ships are traveling, roughly speaking, parallel to each other, at which point you can, to a certain degree, especially if there's a large formation involved, guarantee that if you fire a spread that covers roughly ahead of the enemy, you'll probably hit something. And George Robert asks, while reading The Battleship Builders by Johnston and Buxton, incidentally, it's a really good book, I would recommend picking up, the cableway gantries used on the building ways at Palmer's at Jarrow caught my interest. What are the pros and cons of this system versus other systems for lifting and placing material on a ship being built, i.e. normal gantries, cranes, etc.? I assume the cons won out as I haven't seen any other system like Palmer's, or have I just missed them? The system which you can see here was actually fairly innovative. It was designed to allow very rapid, very precise construction of ships, because you have these two big gantries at either end, because this is two sets of cranes covering two slipways, and then between them are obviously strung a whole bunch of steel cables, and along each steel cable runs a vertical crane head. But, as you might be able to tell if you look carefully at the gantries, the cable ends are also on motorized runners, so the cable ends can be maneuvered back and forth as well. So this means by a combination of moving both of the ends, as well as moving the crane head along the cable, you can position the crane at pretty much any point you like. It's just a matter of geometry. And because there are lots of cables, there are lots of crane heads, that means you can be lifting multiple loads in and out very quickly, very efficiently, and the whole area around the slipway is available for the placing of loads, which can then be picked up and moved in. So you might think, oh, this is fantastic. Why doesn't anyone else use them? Well, here's where the downsides come in. The cables themselves are obviously exposed to open air and very long. They have, according to period reports, about a 5 to 6 year lifespan, which means that every half decade or so, you've got to essentially restring the gantry cranes, which is going to be a little bit of an issue. Another issue is that, as you can see, these are very much fixed installations. They cost a fair bit of money to put in, but once you've put them in, that is the length of ship that you can build. Now, if you've really over-egged it, then great. But in an era where ships had gone from being 300-400 feet long to 500 to 600 to 800 to 900 feet long, there is a very strong possibility that as ships get larger and larger, you may end up with a ship that's too long to build, and you can't really just reposition one of these gantries very easily and stretch everything out, because obviously, one, that's a huge task, and two, even if you did do it, because now the length of the cables is longer, the lifting capacity of each crane will have decreased, which isn't great. Whereas with a more conventional rail-mounted crane, either a rail-mounted overhead crane or just a rail-mounted crane that's mounted to the side of a slipway or a dry dock, if you need to extend said slipway or dry dock, you can also just extend the track that that crane runs on, which gives you a bit more of upgrade capacity. Another limitation is because you are talking about something that's suspended on the end of a very, very long piece of cable, the lifting capacity of each individual crane head is about 3 tons. Now, that's fine if you're undertaking general construction, but of course that weight limit means that, again, as things become heavier and heavier, there is a limit to what kinds of ships you can construct, what kind of material you can install. And yes, you might argue that things like gun turrets and so forth would be installed in the fitting out yards after the ship has been launched, but while the ship is on the slipway, you might have particularly large beams or things like engines and boilers that need to be put in, and those will usually come in at considerably more than 3 tons, which means you're going to need some of the more conventional cranes anyway. Whereas obviously if you have a big overhead gantry crane or one of the monstrous big arm cranes that you sometimes see in other shipyards, they can handle those loads and the small ones. The only disadvantage of them versus this one is the sheer number of individual lifts that this system can do at once. Rob Smith asks, we hear about vessels launching torpedoes and then getting their own back, but were there any witnessed events of a torpedo in a spread hitting another one from the same spread? Possibly anecdotal, but credible witnesses? As far as I'm aware, there isn't such an event that has been witnessed, and that's in large part because even when you're firing all the torpedoes, so you're firing a spread of torpedoes, unfortunately it's not entirely like something like World of Warships, where if you want to fire all the torpedoes in your launcher, they all fire simultaneously and head off, as one big wave. Apart from anything, obviously, the system is designed to handle a certain amount of recoil from the launcher, and if you do it all at once, that could break things. And in a submarine, it's even worse, because if you do a mass spread simultaneously in a submarine, the submarine suddenly got a whole lot lighter, and you're very likely to breach the surface. And back on surface ships, you can see the torpedo is flying and falling a fair distance, and this is in a fairly calm sea. In rougher seas, torpedoes very often will need a little bit of time just to straighten themselves out and head off in the direction you want them to. So if you fired a simultaneous burst of torpedoes, then there's a very, very high chance they're going to interfere and bash into each other even before potentially they've even hit the water from a surface vessel. Plus, if you're trying to fire an actual spread, i.e. a spread that is not just going to be 3, 4 or 5 torpedoes that are desperately trying to stay a foot apart from each other or something like that, you'd need to set each individual torpedo on different gyro settings. Whereas if you do what is 99.9% of the time done, which is, yes, you might be firing a full spread, but you fire the torpedoes in rapid succession, one after the other, that means that for a submarine, you can use your balancing tanks to continuously make adjustments so that you don't end up with massive amounts of buoyancy and end up popping up to the surface. And on a surface ship, these torpedo launchers are trainable, so you can go, okay, this torpedo, this direction, train the torpedo launcher, let's say 2 degrees to the right, now fire the next torpedo, another 2 degrees, fire the next torpedo, or whatever increment of launch you're using. And that means that even in a spread, the torpedoes are going to be launched at very slightly different intervals. So if one does start to wander, unless one turns like full 90 degrees and loses a whole bunch of speed, the chances of them actually smacking into each other is very, very, very remote, to the point that it's pretty much not going to happen. And even if you do have a torpedo that wildly veers off to one side or the other, it's still probably going to have enough forward momentum to carry it across the path of the other torpedoes without issue. But B, it's also a 3D environment. A torpedo that crosses the path of another, even if it's out in depth by a foot or two, might still completely miss the other one. Felipe Sato, or Felipe Sato possibly, asks, we see the change of ship classifications from names, like corvettes and frigates, to the role they're built for, destroyer, cruiser, aircraft carrier. My question is, with your knowledge, what do you think ship classes would be if this transition didn't occur? Would we still be talking about first, second, and third-rate battleships? And what ship class name is your most and least liked? Well, the funny thing is, things like corvette, sloop, brig, frigate, etc. are also technically role or performance descriptions. Like frigate almost certainly has its origins in a term that just means fast, which was kind of the main role of frigates, to be quicker than everything else. Brig is, of course, a reference to a brig rig, same as sloop. So they are still descriptors, but they've been embedded for so long in the age of sail that they have become, as you said, kind of as much a name for a specific genre of ship as they have a particular descriptor of what that ship actually is. And a lot of the switchover, like the amalgamation of corvettes, frigates and sloops and so forth into just cruisers in the late 19th century and so forth, a lot of that comes about simply because the evolving nature of ship technology had gotten to a point where these descriptions weren't really seen as being particularly useful anymore, because you could have a sloop that was faster than a frigate, or you could have a corvette that was bigger than a sloop, or a brig that didn't necessarily have two masts, or a sloop that didn't have a particular setup of sails, and so on and so forth. And that's why they end up all obviously being lumped into cruiser. Then you have torpedo boats, torpedo boat destroyers, that gets shortened to destroyer, and like you said. So if that transition doesn't occur, then I think that kind of leaves you with the first, second, third rating system, essentially. So if people are kind of forced by lack of imagination or circumstance to still use a rating system, the rating system is open to a certain degree of change, because you've got to remember that originally the first through fourth rates were all line of battle vessels. But by the time you get to the Napoleonic Wars, the fourth rate has almost fallen out of use completely and is very definitely not really seen as a line ship unless you absolutely have no other choice. And towards the end of the Age of Sail, the fourth rate is more and more a heavy frigate. And even the third rate, to be honest, by the end of the Age of Sail is beginning to be phased out. But if you have 6 rates of ship going from top to bottom, then at least until aircraft carriers come along, I think they could still potentially adapt that system. So a first rate would be what we would call a battleship. Second rates would probably be what they would later call second-class battleships, but share that space perhaps with armoured cruisers. So a second-rate ship would be either a diminutive battleship or a armoured cruiser that you're really expected to perhaps stand in the line of battle. Third rates would be your larger cruisers. So that would be large protected cruisers, small armoured cruisers, that kind of thing. Your fourth rates would then be your smaller cruisers. Your fifth rates would be your destroyers, and your sixth rates would be escorts, frigates, sloops, corvettes, that kind of stuff. And then as time goes on, the aircraft carrier, I think, would probably always be the aircraft carrier because it doesn't fit with everything else, which, despite they may or may not have torpedoes and so forth, everything else has guns and armour. Carriers kind of stand outside of that. But then if you were to advance that to, say, an interwar setting in the 30s, the first rate would be your battleships, the second rates would be heavy cruisers, the third rates would be light cruisers, i.e. 6-inch cruisers, and perhaps the smaller sort of York, Exeter style 8-inch cruisers. Then your fourth rates would be your sub 10,000 ton 6-inch cruisers. The fifth rates would still be destroyers, but I think the fifth rates would probably now be your big destroyers, like French super destroyers, and your sixth rates would be your smaller 1,1400 ton legacy destroyers, and sloops, corvettes, that kind of escort level of things probably would have been kicked out into either unrated, or maybe they'd invent a seventh rate for them. As for most and least liked class name, I think, for me personally, frigate is my favourite one, because it has the longest history. It, granted, does drop out of usage for a short while, but it always has this notion of an independent command, a smaller ship. It's the most consistent, and it sounds pretty cool. Whereas my least favourite at the moment is actually destroyer. Because although, yes, it sounds very aggressive and cool and everything, as we've kind of been discussing, ship designations have changed over time, reflecting the roles of ships. Destroyer hasn't. You know, destroyers nowadays not only are the displacement of wartime cruisers, World War II era cruisers, but they also fulfill the role of a early 20th century cruiser. And in fact, in some ways, they even verge a little bit above that, perhaps into the role of the armoured or battle cruiser. But they're still called destroyers, partly because of just creep, and partly because people still think it sounds like they're cheaper. And if someone says, oh, we're building a cruiser, idiots in various treasury departments throw their hands up in the air in horror, pretending that this is some kind of novel thing that, honestly, you know, it's really going to be expensive because it's a cruiser, but a destroyer is smaller, therefore a destroyer will be cheaper. And like, no, that's not how it works. But as a result, I really don't like the term destroyer, because if you look at something like a Type 45 in the UK or an Arleigh Burke in the US, you know, what is their role? Defense of the fleet, long-range offensive actions, patrols, multi-role, independent operations. That's a cruiser role. Very, very easily. Destroyers are supposed to be fleet screen and attack on enemy ships directly. Basically, modern destroyers don't do that. Alfred Wilmore asks, I've seen comparisons of wrought iron armour, Harvey armour, and so forth compared by ratio of effectiveness, and wondered how those ratios would be borne out in combat, especially with more disparate timeframes. I'm specifically interested in the case of the Turkish ironclad Mesudai. I understand it had 12 inches of wrought iron armour, which by ratio would be equivalent to 6 inches of Krupp armour. If, during the interwar or World War II period, a hypothetically afloat and somehow in combat Mesudai were hit in the belt by a modern shell, how would its armour fare? How would the armour react differently from 6 inches of interwar Krupp armour, and what calibre of fire could Mesudai withstand without sinking? So the first problem you run into with these kinds of comparisons is that there is no universally agreed way of comparing all of these armours. I mean, even at the time, when you were moving from iron to compound, or compound to Harvey, or Harvey to Krupp, different people gave somewhat different equivalences. So, for example, when you were looking at the transition from iron to compound armour, you can find various reputable authors and period sources that will tell you that compound armour needs only 70, 75 or 80% of the thickness of iron for equivalent protection. And you'll have a similar range of figures every time you step down. So obviously, if you consistently take very generous figures, like say you only need 70% of compound armour and you only need 60% Harvey compared to compound and so forth, you can get down to very, very thin amounts of Krupp armour, supposed to be equivalent to ridiculous amounts of iron. But if you use the really conservative values consistently, you can actually end up with quite a substantial amount of Krupp armour that you need in order to match iron. of obviously a somewhat greater thickness. And then, of course, you have all the figures in between, which are also given. So, for example, taking the 12 inches of iron you mentioned, using the table of values from one particular book, it suggests that 12 inches of iron would be the equivalent of 9.6 inches of compound armour, which would be the equivalent of 6.2 inches of Harvey armour, which would be the equivalent of 4.6 inches of Krupp armour, which would be the equivalent of 3.7 inches of late-era Krupp armour as manufactured by Britain and Germany. But plug a different set of values in and you could get entirely different values again, which obviously you've used a different set of values to get an equivalent of 6 inches of Krupp armour, which is perhaps a more conservative estimate. So, since period sources and later sources all disagree, exactly how much Krupp armour you'd need to be the equivalent of wrought iron, or how much wrought iron is the equivalent of so much Krupp, it's really up in the air unless someone did a whole ton of comparative tests across a whole slew of armours manufactured in different ways, which, again, you know, harking back to the what if you had $1 million, what naval myths would you bust? I'd probably actually try and manufacture a whole bunch of different armours at in different ways and see what their resistances were against a common impactor. But nonetheless, so for your question with Mesudae, we don't necessarily know precisely if there would be a huge difference in terms of overall penetration between 12 inches of wrought iron and 6 inches of Krupp, because we don't actually know, strictly speaking, if those are actually equivalent. But there are a few other things that you would see as definitive differences because of the differences in material. Because face-hardened armour, of course, is designed to shatter incoming projectiles as a first defence, and only then start to resist the incoming, hopefully fragmented projectile, and if not fragmented, at least somewhat slowed. Whereas wrought iron doesn't have that hardened face, so with wrought iron, a shell, a smaller caliber shell, say like a 6-inch shell or something, that might just shatter and do very minimal damage to Krupp face-hardened armour, will still embed itself in wrought iron armour. And if it explodes, it may then blow a big chunk out of that wrought iron armour. So the wrought iron armour, while it would resist small caliber fire, would take considerably more damage from that small caliber fire as compared to Krupp armour. But by the same token, when you're talking about very high energy shells, like 12, 14, 15-inch shells, you may have less overall damage to your armor plate using wrought iron, because if we assume that penetration goes straight through in both cases, then wrought iron, under the kind of stresses that a high velocity World War II era battleship shell would exert, it might very well punch a hole through that iron armor, but it will probably punch a hole roughly caliber width, because the iron, being somewhat softer, will just tend to bend and flow around said shell. Unless you talk about, you know, really, really high-speed impacts where the material can't physically get out of the way. And that's a whole other interesting bit of engineering, which, when I get around to showing you the target plate that's at the Nobel Museum in Karlskoga in Sweden, you actually can see the differences in the way the material has reacted, because the armor slab there has been penetrated multiple times by the same caliber shell, but at different velocities, and you can see the way the material has reacted at those different velocities, whether it's shattered and been shoved away, or whether it's mostly flowed out of the way of the incoming projectile. Whereas with a face-hardened armor, an impact that blows straight through it is going to result in a fair bit of cracking that goes in a radius around the armor. So in cases of through-and-through penetration, you might end up with overall more structural damage to modern armor than you would to wrought iron. But then, as I said, velocity comes into play and all sorts. It's a very, very complex field. I do need to actually show you that target up close at some point. His Hibernian Majesty Rigel the 16th, Dominator 600 billion subjects, progenitor of many and nobody's puppet, asks, when Ian McCullum did his video on the Chambers flintlock machine gun, he laments that he could not find any first-hand accounts of it in combat. Considering the numerous naval battles it was supposedly used in, do you have any better luck? So this is the Chambers repeating musket, which is the immediate forerunner of the repeating machine gun, which is essentially just a 7-barrel version. But while I could track down a number of battles where it is very likely that the gun was actually used, or at least was present, I haven't been able to find any first-hand accounts of the gun in use. And to be honest, it's going to be relatively difficult to do so, because most first-hand accounts of the battles are either relatively high level, so they're not going to make specific mention of specific weapons, and also ultimately, although obviously it is a continuous fire machine gun, it is using standard musket type gunnery, which means that in the hubbub of a naval battle where you've got muskets, carronades, and cannons going off left, right, and centre, the fact that there's a particularly large amount of musket fire coming from one given direction may not attract enough notice to be written about specifically. Now, individual accounts of sailors, perhaps in the Battle of Sackett's Harbour and so forth, may mention the use of such a weapon. And the thing is, 99.9% it was used in combat at least a few times, in part because, as Ian mentions in his video, the British captured some examples of both the Chambers machine gun and some of the Chambers rifles as well. And that indicates they were used in combat because, well, if you're facing off against the British on the Great Lakes, you're going to use something like that before you give it up. Now, the interesting thing, where I think perhaps it would be the easiest to track down evidence for its direct use in combat, would be aboard USS Constitution, because there seems to be a reasonable amount of evidence that she mounted at least one in her fighting tops towards the end of the War of 1812, and of course she fought the very last action of the War of 1812 from a naval perspective, several weeks after the war was actually over, but there you go, with the taking of the Cyane and Levant, and then her subsequent pursuit by other British vessels. So if there is any battle where you are going to be specifically able to prove that the ship had such a weapon, was fighting in a close action, and therefore was probably fairly likely to have used it, it's going to be that battle. And then it would just be a case of doing a deep dive into the archives to dig up every single personal account that was written about that battle and see if anyone mentions some weird multi-barrel American musket that continuously fires, or possibly jams at some point, who knows. Stéphane Perrault asks, what is your opinion on the Vengeur class third rates? They seem to get a lot of hate, but a lot of these ships had a very long service life in spite of their supposedly bad build quality. Could you elaborate? Yeah, I think they do get a little bit more hate than is fully deserved. Interestingly, I think a question about this particular class, also known as the 40 Thieves, was one of the very earliest Drydock questions I ever got, many hundreds of Drydocks ago. So, for those of you unaware, the Vengeur class were initially third-rate ships of the line, so 74 gunners, built in the latter stages of the Napoleonic Wars. The core reason I think that they get a lot of grief is because some of them were built in royal dockyards, but a lot of them were farmed out to various commercial dockyards, and a number of those commercial dockyards had very dodgy practices, either massively overcharging, or being very slow in construction, or having pretty poor build quality, and sometimes multiple of those. And as a result, it ended up costing a lot more money as a class, and a bunch of them weren't particularly good, which led to obviously the moniker of the 40 Thieves, because they were thieving from the Treasury and from the British people as a whole. But as a general moniker, as kind of a nickname, okay, fine, whatever, but it was, I think, ultimately a little bit of an unfair description, because, kind of as you note, some of them have very long service lives. And it's interesting, when you look at all the ships built, the ones built in the royal dockyards tend to have very long careers, only going out of service in the 1860s and later, when ironclads are coming along, and frankly, at that point, the 74-gun ship of the line is quite obsolete. As far as their dimensions and armament and those elements of the design go, they're actually pretty serviceable, good, fundamental, on-paper designs for a 74-gunner. And then you look at the ones that go out of service very quickly, because these ships are being commissioned in the 1810s, some of them are being sold and broken up in the 1820s and 1830s. So some of them are barely even seeing a decade of service, let alone two. And that's incredibly unusual for a wooden ship of the line. And so I think those are probably the ones where you've got pretty poor build quality and so forth. The Royal Navy's just going, yeah, these might be relatively recently built ships, but they're so poor, we're just going to dispose of them as soon as humanly possible or as soon as issues crop up. But others, as I ones built in the Royal Dockyards and some built in other private docks, those have much longer service lives, and if those have been built correctly, then they may be obviously, private docks may have overcharged or taken too long building them, but fundamentally because the design is fine and as long as the build quality is fine, I think at least one lasted even into the 20th century, and a number had various improved roles throughout the early part of the 19th and the mid-19th century, eventually ending up as defensive, what they call block ships, i.e. equipped with a steam engine and used as coastal guard vessels. And in fact, when I was charting the development of ships during that period, we actually used HMS Blenheim, which was one of the Vengeur class, as our kind of guide, as it was constantly refitted and upgraded and turned into various other roles. So clearly, if you built a Vengeur class properly, it was actually a pretty good design. It's just there were some that were either overpriced or poorly built, or both. Ivan asks, how would you rate Imperial Russian armoured cruisers in comparison with other such vessels built at the time for various other fleets? They built a modest number, which makes sense for primarily land-based power, but could they hold their own next to British, French, Spanish, German, etc. armoured cruisers? This is actually quite an interesting one, because the Russians originate the armoured cruiser, and they're, at least, although as you say they build relatively few of them, they are actually fairly consistent in building them from the invention of the armoured cruiser through to its near enough extinction. And they cap it all off with a kind of semi-battle cruiser along the lines of Blücher, which is the second armoured cruiser, Rurik. That ship really needs its own video at some point. But if we'll compare a few classes of Russian armoured cruiser with approximate contemporaries. So we're going to have to pick and choose from different navies, because the Royal Navy stops building armoured cruisers for a while, then restarts. So there's a bit of a void there, and different people pick up the whole armoured cruiser idea as well at different stages. So if we start with an early Russian armoured cruiser, not the earliest, but an earlier one, the Admiral Nakhimov of the mid-1880s. One thing which I will immediately note about Russian armoured cruisers as a whole is that they seem to retain a ship rig, i.e. sails and everything, or the ability to carry them, much, much later than basically almost everybody else. Everyone else has moved over to fighting masts or pole masts very quickly. And so, for example, Admiral Nakhimov has two fully rigged masts, and her immediate comparator, which is the Orlando-class cruiser, yes, there are yards, but the Orlandos are very clearly steam vessels with masts that are there mostly for flags and things like that. Now, if you compare the two, it's rather interesting. The Admiral Nakhimov has considerably more heavy guns. It has 8 8-inch guns for its main battery, as opposed to the 2 9.2-inch guns that the Orlando has. But the Orlando class has those 2 9.2-inch guns in semi-enclosed centerline mountings fore and aft, whereas the Nakhimov is still sticking everything in broadside along the hull, kind of almost like a central battery ironclad. They then both have a secondary battery of 10 6-inch guns and a whole smattering of smaller guns, plus some torpedo tubes. Although the British ship has slightly more and slightly larger torpedo tubes. So overall, in terms of absolute broadside firepower, the Nakhimov has slightly more. There's more 8-inch guns it can bring to bear on either side, but it is carrying a lot more guns for only a relatively small increase in firepower, because you've got a broadside of 4 8-inch guns versus 2 9.2-inch guns. Actual broadside weight is relatively close, even though the British ship has fewer shells. They're about the same speed. The British ship is considerably longer range, and they actually have relatively similar thicknesses of armour, although obviously distribution is slightly different as well. Then if we go ahead to the, apologies to anyone who understands Russian, Pamiet Azova, which is a mid to late 1880s Russian armoured cruiser. We've still got full ship rigging, and compared to a similar period vessel, which is the Depuis de l'Homme of France, similar levels of displacement, similar levels of main battery firepower. Both ships now have 2 guns. The Russians have a pair of 8 inches, the French have a pair of 7.6 inches. But the French, in terms of their secondary, tertiary, etc. battery, have much fewer guns. The secondary, for example, is 6.4-inch guns. The Russians have 13 6-inch guns. The Russian cruiser is also significantly better protected, but it is notably slower. 17 knots as opposed to the 20 knots of the Depuis de l'Homme. So you can see the French are basically trading off a degree of protection and the smaller guns' firepower in exchange for moving considerably quicker. And the French also have a better torpedo capability. They have more torpedoes and larger torpedoes, which is kind of a running theme at this point. But then if we move to the very end of the 20th century, we compare the Cressy class, Britain's re-entry into the armoured cruiser world, with the Bayan class, which is basically the Russian 19th going on 20th century armoured cruiser. So the Bayans are capable of 21 knots, same as the Cressys. To be fair, the Cressys do displace significantly more than the Bayans, which is interesting because up until this point, the Russian armoured cruisers have generally been, for their contemporaries, relatively large ships. But with that said, the Bayans still have a greater maximum thickness of protection, almost 8 inches of belt versus 6 inches on the Cressys. And then armament-wise, the Russians have 2 8-inch guns and 8 6-inch guns. The Cressys have 2 9.2-inch guns and 12 6-inch guns, although given the fact that, as I said, the Cressys are about 4,000 to 5,000 tons heavier, that's probably not that surprising. The Russians are still persisting with relatively small numbers of small torpedoes as well. So, broadly speaking, I would say that the main things I would count against Russian armoured cruisers throughout the period that they're mostly producing them is that they tend to be somewhat shorter range and, on average, slightly behind the curve speed-wise, although they are often of par with other contemporary armoured cruisers. But they usually carry considerably more armour than the average contemporary armoured cruiser and tend to have fairly extensive secondary battery, so then sacrifice range for that. So as shorter range defensive or fleet armoured cruisers, they're actually not too bad, minus the perhaps far too prolonged insistence on ship rigging. But if you want them to do the traditional long-distance overseas flagship cruiser role, they are perhaps a little bit lacking there. And finally, Edward Olson asks, in the game Wolfpack, the destroyers escorting the convoys are listed as tribals. How often were tribal class used for Atlantic convoys? Given their emphasis on guns, they seem ill-suited for the role. The tribal class did actually have a reasonably active convoy escorting career, but not very often in the Atlantic. They do show up on some Atlantic convoys, particularly in the very, very early part of the war, 1939-1940, when it's all hands on deck. They really are struggling for pretty much any ship that can be used in convoy escort. But when you look at the vast majority of the admittedly relatively limited number of convoys the tribals escort, they're almost all convoys to and from Norway, before Norway is taken over by the Germans, and then convoys to and from Russia, the Arctic convoys, so the PQ-QP series, and then the JW series as well, which supersedes the PQ series. And that actually makes a certain degree of sense because they're relatively shorter deployments, so you can get them back to the home fleet in a hurry if you absolutely have to. But 2, the convoys from Scotland to Norway and then from Britain to Russia, of all the convoys, are the ones where surface interception by German cruisers, destroyers, capital ships, etc. are the most likely. And as you say, tribals mostly emphasize gun actions. They're very much surface action destroyers. if there's anywhere you're going to put the tribals on convoy escort, it's the place where they're most likely to fight Kriegsmarine surface ships in a straight-up engagement. And unsurprisingly, that's where they mostly end up being allocated. And very often when they're on those convoys, they will not necessarily be in direct convoy escort mode, but they will be escorting the heavier units that are covering the convoys. So, for example, on the PQ convoys, you will not really very often, if ever, find a tribal in the close escort, but you will very often find a tribal or two either with the cruisers or with the battleships and the carriers in the distant and heavy covering forces. But to find a tribal on an Atlantic convoy run would be very rare. They basically usually only be there if it's a very early war and they're desperate, or if the tribal is going to and from the US for some other reason anyway. So maybe it's escorted a Royal Navy capital ship over to the US and it's heading back, and, well, might as well put it on a convoy to help out because it's an extra hull, something like that. And that brings us to the end of the Patreon Drydock for this month. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening, and I hope to see you again in another video soon.